Right, welcome to this video, another video from IDIS regarding the setup and configuration of IDIS NVR cameras and also the VMS software called IDIS Center. We're making this video kind of in lieu of the fact that we cannot accommodate any in-house certification training right now. So with this and the rest of our videos, we're hoping that this can serve as a guide for first-time users or those seeking a little bit of a refresher on how to configure IDIS NVRs on cameras. This is going to be kind of an informal video, not going to be too polished and edited and so forth. So we're just going to go through all the major or most important settings of the NVR and then some of the other features as well. Hopefully covering everything that you need to know to successfully set up the IDIS NVR with cameras and the IDIS Center software, VMS software as well. So it's going to be informal. What we'll do is in the description below, look for the timelines on the major subjects. So if there's something particular you need to know, you can go to one of those, or otherwise watch the video in full. Okay, so let's dive into it. As you see on the screen here, when you first start up an IDIS NVR fresh out of the box, it's going to start up with what we call a wizard, and it's going to try and walk you through or automatically configure most items for you. So we'll run through the wizard and then also run through the individual systems there. As you can see, first one is to select your language and click OK, and then you have to create a password for the NVR. I'm just going to create a quick password here. You have to use a special character. I think the password has to be minimum 8 characters. Alright, once you've created a password, below that is a thing called export UPR. What this will do is it will export a file onto a flash drive connected to the USB port on the NVR. Should you ever lose the password of the NVR, you can use that file to define a new password. So obviously you need to keep that file secure. We don't have any backdoors or anything like that to be able to recover a password other than the UPR option or the email option below here. So you can create your email down here, for example. Okay, so just create an email down here. So if you use this email option, it's possible then to recover the password via email or using the export UPR file as we explained. The next part of the wizard will try and set up the date and time, the recording options and so forth. So if you click on next, the date and time, what you need to do here is to set the time zone. Okay. My time zone is going to be Central Time, US and Canada, right here, and then adjust the time accordingly. My time is correct as it is right now, and the correct date. Actually, the date is one ahead. Set the correct date there. Okay, click on next, and the recording time and the recording profile. You can accept the default H.265 recording mode. That's fine, and obviously we accommodate H.264 recording as well. Let's finish the first part of the wizard, and then we have network setup. It's going to try and set up the network automatically for you using UPnP, and if you have a LAN connection to the device that has an internet connection, you can set up the FEN automatically as well. So let's click on next. It's going to do auto configuration. What you can do then is click on the test button. It's going to query your router to see if it can establish the IP and gateway and subnet mask automatically for you, and also to use UPnP. Right, once you're done with that, you can click next. Then it's going to ask you to create a FEN name. So in this FEN name, you can create any FEN name, usually pertinent to the location of the NVR or the purpose of the NVR. I'm just going to put test-ls for my name. And then you do a check to see if that name is available. Obviously, your NVR has to be connected to the internet because it's going to check with our FEN server whether that name is available. If you're successful, you get the test ls name that is available, and you click OK. This name is now going to be assigned to this NVR for the FEN purpose, and we'll discuss what that is in a little while. And click on Finish. Don't worry about that. I've just got a strange monitor connected to my NVR. Do take note that the monitor has to have some standard resolutions in order to work. And yeah, we're going to log into our NVR as we created a password before. Okay, so this is now logged into our NVR. What it does immediately, the NVR will go to the registration page to try and register cameras. So it's automatically, as you see in the top left hand side, has gone to camera registration, and it's automatically queried the network for IDIS cameras. So this is part of what we call the direct IP platform, to make it easier for you to register cameras and to find cameras on the network, especially IDIS cameras. There is no requirement to use IP addresses or usernames or passwords. IDIS cameras will be discovered automatically by the NVR and added to the network, or added to the NVR. And as you can see on the screen here, it has found 3 cameras and added them to the camera registration page. You'll see that these are new IDIS cameras by the blue dots next to the names in the left hand column, and also by the flashing orange squares that you'll see there, meaning that these cameras are now ready to be added to the NVR and start recording and so forth. And as you can see, we never used any search function or usernames and passwords or IP addresses to find these cameras at all. If I right click on a camera, we can actually find out some information about it. In the information topic there, we'll see that the protocol of this camera is direct IP. We can see the part number and the firmware version. We can also see MAC address and the IP address. So there is an IP address. Just in this case, we use what's called a link local address. So that's a 169.254 IP address. If you don't know what a link local address is, please Google it. And so this is basically an IP address that is used by the device when there is no DHCP server on the camera side network. And why do we say camera side network? Well, the NVR has 2 network cards. One is for the internet connection, or what we call the client side, and the other side is for connecting cameras. So all the PoE ports on the NVR plus the network or the network extension sorry, plus the video in extension port on the NVR is connected to one network card, meaning the camera side network, and the other network card is connected to what we call the client side network, or the internet, where your office network or the computers running IDIS Center might be. You can also see the resolution, and the codec for this particular camera being used is H.264. Click on another camera, ask for information. On this camera, you're going to see that we use Direct IP 2.0. So this is our later iteration of Direct IP, and the difference between Direct IP 2.0 and Direct IP, call it 1.0, is that in 1.0 the camera had to be in one of 2 states. Either it's in what we call IDIS mode or Open IP mode, meaning that it has an IP address and username and password just like a normal ONVIF camera, and it will in fact act like an ONVIF camera at the same time. Or you could put it in the Direct IP mode, which meant that it was strictly an IDIS only camera, and it would only talk to IDIS NVRs and IDIS equipment, and it could not be used in that mode with any third-party application. The Direct IP 2.0 protocol allows the camera to actually be available to either IDIS mode, meaning with a username and password and a IP address, or in Direct IP protocol, meaning that it just discovers automatically, like you've seen here with the 169.254 link local address only, and doesn't need a username and password or anything like that. So that's the only difference between Direct IP 2.0 and 1.0 so far. And the third camera we have here is actually also a Direct IP 2.0 camera, and you can see the resolution and the codec in this case is H.265. Okay, so I've now automatically discovered these cameras, and if I click on apply down here, these cameras are going to be automatically added to the NVR, and it's asking whether you really want to register the cameras. It's also got a run self-diagnosis option here. I would advise that you uncheck that. It takes quite long to run a diagnostic on each camera, and it's not absolutely necessary, especially when using IDIS cameras. So if you click OK on that, it's now registering those cameras into the NVR and opening up the live view page where you should see the cameras populate. And you also see that there's a red dot that has appeared on each camera, and that means that the camera is recording. And the little clock next to that means that the camera is recording in time-lapse mode. Time-lapse meaning it's recording in 24/7, and we'll have to adjust that based on our needs, but we'll need to do some work on the event side as well. And you can also see this camera has a little P next to it, or a P symbol in there, meaning that it has some PTZ functionality. In this case, that is really a PTZ camera. And the third camera here is actually a bullet style camera, and it also has a P in it. Why does it have a P in it? Well, it also means it has some PTZ capabilities. It actually doesn't have the pan and tilt capability, but it has the zoom capability. So we use the same symbol P. So this camera has got a motorized varifocal lens, and we're able to zoom the camera using the NVR or using the client software to achieve the final zoom factor that we want to operate the camera in without having to climb a ladder or anything like that. So that is what the P symbol stands for. Okay, this is the main live view page on the NVR. If I double click on a camera, I can make the image larger or smaller. I could divide the page into a 2x2 format as well, and obviously 3x3, 6x6, and so forth. In this particular case, this NVR is a 16-channel NVR, so the maximum I can go to is a 4x4 screen, which will be 16 camera channels as such. Okay, if you have more cameras, in this case when I'm viewing the cameras in a 2x2 mode, I could switch to the next group of 4 cameras. Obviously we don't have any cameras on this one. This will be the third group, fourth group, and then back to the first group where I have my cameras. This is a freeze button on top here where I could freeze all the images. It's just going to freeze the live motion on the cameras so that I can inspect something. This is a panic mode. Obviously, if I turn panic mode on, you'll see that these time-lapse buttons will turn into an orange dot. And what that means is that I'm now recording all the cameras in a very high resolution, in their highest resolution available. And this is kind of meant for when you have a crisis situation and you want to record all the cameras in the highest resolution during that crisis, where it may be an active shooter situation or so. Alright, but this is only available on the NVR itself. In most cases, you're not using the NVR interface as your monitoring interface, although some applications may do that. In most cases, the NVR is going to be put into a rack without any monitor attached to it, and you're going to be using the IDIS Center software to view the camera images remotely. Alright, so make sure to turn the panic mode off again, because otherwise you're recording in the highest resolution mode at all times. You can also define sequences or turn the sequence on and off. Obviously most of you should know what a camera sequence is, and so the most important menu that we're going to be seeing here is the setup menu, which is this little gear icon. So if I click on the setup menu, we'll open up the setup menu, which has icons on the left hand side defining the section, meaning system, camera, recording, etc. on the left hand side, and each time we click on a new icon, we'll open up a new submenu, and details obviously on the right hand side. Each submenu will open up different details on the right hand side as well. So that's kind of the layout of the system setup function. And then the last function on the main screen here that's important is the search function. So if we want to look at the playback video or the recorded video, we can click on the little play button there, and then we can select time-lapse search, for example. This will show us the cameras in whatever format we select. We can see the date and time. If we press on the play button, that'll play the latest recording. You can see the recording timelines here at the bottom, and so that'll play all the cameras, and we can obviously jog forward and jog backwards using the jog controls here, or we can go to a specific date and time of recording, etc. So this is a visual of the direct IP solution by IDIS. So what is direct IP? Direct IP is a proprietary protocol developed by IDIS between our NVRs and our cameras. So in the layout here you can see that cameras are connected directly to the NVR, or cameras are connected to switches and then connected to the NVR. Either way, that's in the blue outline that you see here, and then in the green outline that you see is that the NVR is then connected to the client-side network, or the office network, or the computer network, however you want to name that, and that's represented by the green lines. So the computers here are running IDIS Center software that we're going to have a look at a little later, how to configure that software. So this is a VMS software that will allow you to access the NVRs, view the video, view the recorded video, and also perform maintenance functions on the actual NVRs themselves. So what's really important to note, and designated by the blue and by the green lines, is that the NVR internally has two network interface cards. One is dedicated to the camera network, and the other is dedicated to the actual office network, or what we call a client-side network. So this is very, very good for security, obviously, and also makes use of the direct IP protocol, meaning that the cameras do not need to have IP addresses, they do not need to have usernames and passwords to be registered to the NVR. And that's one of the big benefits of direct IP, making the installation side much, much quicker, not having to keep a record of passwords and the usernames and IP addresses and so forth. You can connect a monitor directly to the NVR, as we'll see, and then also that can be connected to the internet, and then using our proprietary FEN server, which is for every network, we can also then connect IDIS Center remotely from the internet to any of the NVRs, or connect via our IDIS mobile software. Here you can see a typical representation of an NVR, what the back of the NVR looks like and all the connections. This will be a 6332 type NVR, our 6000 series. You can see that it has multiple Cat5 connections at the back, or PoE ports in this case. So in this case we've got 16 PoE ports at the back here. PoE ports will obviously provide power to the cameras, and also the data connection into the NVR from those cameras. It has an extra port here called video in extension, and then a network client port as well. So if we look at the 16 PoE ports plus the video in extension port, those all form one switch, if you would like it, and those all are connected to the network interface card dedicated to the camera network. So for the camera network, you've got basically 17 connections, and then for the client connection, in this case, you've got one connection which will go out to the computer network. The video in extension port is not a PoE port, and what that is meant for example, this is a 6332, which is a 32 channel NVR. The 16 cameras here can be connected directly, and the balance of the other cameras must be brought in via a switch and connected to the video in extension port. The network client port, as I said, is a separate network card with its own IP address and going to the WAN side of the network. The eSATA ports, in this particular NVR, we have 6 internal hard disk drives, 6 bays for hard disk drives internally. We also manufacture an eSATA box which has space for another 4 hard drives, and we can connect 4 of those eSATA boxes to this particular NVR. We also have some RS-485 and RS-232 connections, plus alarm inputs and alarm outputs available here via these connections here. And then we have, for the monitor connection, we can either connect via HDMI or VGA to a local monitor for the configuration of an NVR. And then there is also an audio in and audio out port for the NVR itself. Remember that all our cameras also have audio in and audio out, and this is a extra connection for the actual audio on the NVR itself, and then we look at the power connection. So this is typically what our NVRs look like on the rear port. Obviously with the different models, some of our 2000 series models only has 2 hard drives in, and the 1000 series only has 1 hard drive. The 8000 series has 8 hard drives in. Some of the NVRs have less than 16 ports, some of them have 4 ports or 8 ports available. And then we'll look at our 8364, the DR8364 NVR. This is a 64 channel NVR, a 4K recorder, and on the back of this NVR we have 4 RJ45 connections and 2 fiber ports. 3 of the RJ45 connectors are for video input, and the third connection, or the fourth connection, is for the client-side network. So again, this NVR, just like the others, also has 2 NIC cards, one for the camera side and one for the client side. On the camera side, we only have 3 connectors here, meaning that these are not PoE connectors or PoE ports. In this case, you have to use switches to bring in the cameras onto the NVR, either via copper in the RJ45 ports or fiber. And then we similarly have eSATA ports, audio ports, and the video out ports. This particular NVR also is a D model, and it has dual redundant power supplies, as you can see here. This NVR, a 64 channel NVR, you can consider this NVR to be 2 32 channel modules inside the NVR. And so we have separate drives for the odd channels versus the even channels in recording. So out of the 8 hard drives internally, 4 of them are dedicated to the odd number channels and 4 of them are dedicated to the even number channels. This NVR also has a DR8364F model that's available. Instead of camera registration in the F model is a failover model, and the purpose of the failover module is to take over when there is a failure in an NVR. So, for example, if you had 2 NVRs deployed to record 128 cameras, and you installed a third unit, which is a F model or a failover model, then the failover will monitor the other 2 NVRs, NVR number 1 and NVR number 2. Should either of them fail, the failover model will take over the cameras on the network of that particular NVR. So if NVR number 1 fails, the failover NVR will take over the cameras from NVR number 1. NVR number 2 will still record its cameras. At such time, when you restore the operation of NVR number 1, there's a failback option there, and the failback option will take back the cameras from the failover unit and start recording them back onto the NVR number 1. So when you see us do camera registration in the NVR, that will be replaced by a failover configuration for the NVR. Right, so since this video is more about the configuration of the NVR, let's go back to the live view. So in the live view here, again, we see the 3 cameras that we started off, and remember these were IDIS cameras in the direct IP mode. Now, what about if you needed to add a third-party cameras or a IDIS camera that's not in the direct IP mode, meaning that you want to register it via the IDIS mode, or a third-party camera would be registered normally using the ONVIF configuration. If you don't know what ONVIF is, please again Google that. But basically, third-party cameras are normally ONVIF compliant, which means that they should work in third-party systems, meaning IDIS cameras should work in any other manufacturer's VMS, and any other manufacturer's camera should also work in IDIS NVRs if they are in the ONVIF conformance mode. So how do we register a new camera to the system, or how do we register an IDIS camera to the system, or a third-party camera to the system once we've gone through the wizard? Well, from the main live page that we're in right now, we can right-click and go to camera registration from this page. So that's how you would register new cameras to the system, is right-click on the live screen and then go to the camera registration page. Now, if you'd added any more IDIS cameras to the system, direct IP cameras, they would again just pop up here automatically. We wouldn't have to do anything else. They would just pop up here with the blue square and the orange square like we saw initially when we registered these cameras. But if the camera is not in the direct IP mode, or it's a third-party camera, then we've got a couple of extra steps to do, because now we have to go and search for those cameras, and we then have to register those cameras using an IP address or a username and password and so forth. So it's very important to know right now that there is a network card attached to the camera network, meaning all the PoE ports at the back of the NVR, and also the video in extension ports. If you're powering cameras on an external switch and bringing that into the NVR, they all connected to the same network interface card connected to the camera side network. So that camera side network also has an IP address attached to it, the network interface cards, right? At the moment, we're only registering cameras to the system with a link local address. So it's not really important that the NIC card or the network interface card has an IP address. If it also has a link local IP address, then that is good enough in order to be able to see cameras like you see right now. It sees these cameras that are in the link local address mode. But if we need to change that, we can go to the scan button here and go to the third party scan, which will reveal the interface to search for new cameras in the third party scan, and in the center here you will see something called advanced setup. So in the advanced setup, I can see that this is the configuration settings for the camera side network interface card. So really important. If you need to change these functions, because you're working with a camera with a specific IP address range, you can only see those cameras obviously if the NVR is in the same subnet as those cameras. Right now we're just working with link local addresses, meaning the 169.254 addresses, and if you need to see or if your camera that you're looking for does not operate with link local addresses, which most cameras do not, as far as I know only IDIS cameras and access cameras operate with a linked local address, then you will need to assign an IP address to the network interface card that coincides with the camera IP address that you're looking for. If your camera is set to a DHCP mode, then obviously you could also change the NVR to be the DHCP server, right? And that would then provide the IP address to that third-party camera and also make the NVR be on the same IP subnet so that you can discover that particular camera. You can also configure this as a DHCP client if you have a DHCP server on the camera network already, giving those cameras an IP address. Then you would want the NVR camera side NIC card to obtain an IP address in the same IP range as your camera already has. Or if your camera is just configured manually to some IP address and you want the NVR to be in the same IP range, then you would select the manual option here and change the network card of the NVR to be in that same IP range as your camera, so that you can then discover those cameras. So those are the options for changing the IP address range of the NIC card attached to the NVR for camera side network. Really, really important. In my case, we're working with IDIS cameras only, so they do not need an IP address. They are quite okay to work with a linked local IP address. So we're not going to configure the camera side NIC card at all. Okay, but back to the third-party scan page. As you see here at the top, we can scan for a specific protocol, IDIS being one of those protocols, Access being another protocol, Sony and Panasonic and so forth. If your camera is one of these manufacturers, first try this protocol when you're scanning for them. If you don't have one of these manufacturers, then we're going to default to ONVIF conformance. So ONVIF, as I explained, is kind of a generic protocol that we can discover cameras between manufacturers so that we can try and operate those cameras on, in this case, an IDIS NVR. So if I scan for ONVIF conformance, I should be able to find any IDIS cameras that are not in the direct IP mode, but we also have an IDIS mode. So I'm just going to scan for IDIS mode cameras, do a scan here, and if any cameras are found, they'll appear in this list on the left hand side. And as you see, this camera has just appeared here on the left hand side, DC-S1263WH. That camera has appeared and it's still searching for more cameras. I know I don't have any other cameras, so I'm going to stop the search right here and close this window. And now I have a fourth camera here. It's not a direct IP camera, but it's an IDIS camera. So what I can do is take this camera and then drag this camera into any one of these slots that I want to. I'm just going to drag it here into slot number 4, drop it into that slot, and now I get an interface that asks me for a username and a password for that camera. So this has obviously been predefined by you in a third-party camera, for example. In this case, I think it only has a username, and there comes the camera. So there's my fourth camera being populated. In that square, you can see also the orange dot, meaning that it's ready to be applied and to be registered to this particular NVR. If I right-click on this camera and choose information, we should now see that the protocol of this particular camera is IDIS. That's the firmware version and the IP address. So again, IDIS cameras can still operate even in the IDIS mode on a linked local IP address. Not all cameras can do this. So again, you have to pay attention to what the IP address situation of your third-party camera is and change your NVR in line with that particular IP address range. Alright, we can also see that the camera is connected to the local port on the NVR, port number 5, and click OK, and apply, and that camera will now be registered into the system as well. Do you want to register the camera? Yes. And you can see now that the camera has appeared there. We should get the red dot appearing soon. There's the red dot, meaning that the camera has now started recording. It's also got the P for PTZ functionality. So right now I have 4 cameras registered into this NVR, and we're ready to move on with the rest of the process. So what we're going to cover first is the setup functions, the most important setup functions, and then we'll kind of go back to the other setup functions or configuration options in the setup menu. Alright, so assuming we have all the cameras we need, we can then go into the setup at the top. And the first page that we see is in the system menu and general, and you will see there's a site name here. So it's a good idea to give your NVR a name, just so that later on when we connect this maybe to a IDIS Center software, we can then see the name of all our NVRs and differentiate between those names. So I'm just going to call this a test. Oops. Alright, so T_NVR, that's good enough for me. You can see that the firmware version on this particular NVR is 7.0.2. It's a DR6316 NVR, and if I needed to upgrade the firmware on the NVR, I can put a USB flash drive into the NVR containing the software and then hit the upgrade button here. It would then look on the USB drive to see if there was a firmware version. You can select that firmware version and upgrade the firmware of the NVR. Okay, it's a good idea once you've finished the configuration of an NVR to use this export option here. You'd need a USB flash drive plugged into the USB port of the NVR. Hit export, and it's going to export a file which you can rename here and name it for the NVR that you're configuring. Do an export, save that file. That'll allow you to restore a replacement NVR if you ever need to replace the system. So very, very importantly, that's a good idea. Once you've completely configured this NVR, is to come back here and use the export option. While you're doing that export option, I would probably do another 2 files as well. The one we've already seen is the export UPR file that we saw earlier on. But also if we go into the camera registration mode here, back into the camera registration mode, under the scan button here, there's a option for camera list. And in that camera list, there's an export option here as well. So once you've registered all the cameras and put them into the camera tiles that you want them to be on, if you do an export here, it'll export a CSV file. So there's 3 files that you should have on your USB drive when you've completely configured this NVR. One is the export UPR file from the initial setup, where you can then recover this the password of the NVR if you ever lose it. The second one is this camera list file, which will store a list of the cameras that you attach to this NVR. Okay, and the third one, as we saw before, was back in the configuration menu, or the setup configuration menu, under the export option here by setup. So those 3 files will allow us to then completely recover this NVR. Maybe if the NVR gets damaged in any way and we need to replace the NVR, we can then completely recover the system without having to redo all the configuration from the start again. Okay, the other options on this page, one of the real important ones is the bottom one, which is called troubleshooting reporting. If ever you run into some trouble with the NVR and it has some kind of an issue and you need the help, our help to configure or to find the problem on the system, the troubleshooting reporting, again, from here you can export this onto a USB drive on the NVR. So all you do here is go and generate a report. Click on the little plus sign. It says, are you sure you want to request a troubleshooting report? It's now going to generate a report and put it all into what we call a dump file. And this is a file that you should send to us if you need our help with an NVR. This gives us some troubleshooting logs and information that we can then use to try and assist you to find any particular problems on the NVR itself. Once the report is completed, you can check next to that and again export this onto a USB drive connected to one of the USB ports and send us that file. This report can also be done remotely through the IDIS Center software that we'll see in the next video. So if you don't have access to the NVR itself physically to do this, you can also do this through our IDIS Center software remotely. From the same system menu, we can also set the date and the time. We did this during the setup wizard before, but if you need to change anything, that can be done in the date and time here. We can also use time sync in here, which will sync automatically to a NTP server. There's a lot of these are available, or pick your own server or use the computer that you're using for a VMS as your time server, which will mean that they're always synced together. To set up users in the system, these are done on a group basis, meaning that you have right now by default you have only an administrator group. You can set up a secondary group. Let's call these the guard group, for example. So then you would choose permissions for these. Now obviously guard should not have access to the configuration settings of the particular NVR. So do you want to allow a guard to shut down the system? Probably not. Would you allow them to upgrade? Probably not. Yes, they can do color control, system check, PTZ control, alarm out controls, covert camera views perhaps, audio factory reset. No, we don't want a guard to do a factory reset. They can do search and clip copy. Do you want them to be able to do setup? No. If we uncheck the setup, then that also unchecks all the options below that, so that guards couldn't do those types of setup. If we needed to hide any cameras from a particular group of employees, for example the guard, we can do it with this section here at the bottom. So if you want to hide any cameras, you can click on here and then highlight the cameras which should be hidden from this particular camera group. And that can even be done by a schedule. So if you have different levels of employees working at different times, that can be scheduled as well. So that's creating a secondary group called guards. And now once we've created the group, we can now create users under that group. So we can create a user here. Let's just do a generic guard user. So that's going to be the user name of the particular user, and let's create a password and call that guard. I don't know, exclamation 1. Use an email address here. I'm just going to create a short false email address, but this will allow you to recover the password if you create a usable email address there. Okay, so we've created a user called guard under the guard group, and that's how we create a new user. So it's important to notice what are these guard groups used for. Well, this is used to log into the NVR itself in the same interface that you're seeing right now. If the guard is using the NVR and the monitor connected to the NVR as the primary guarding or viewing monitor. This is not done very often, as I said before, and usually you use IDIS Center software or a VMS viewing software, client software, in order to view the video on the NVR, either live or recorded. So depending on the level of person that you want to register the NVR to their software, you're going to use these same credentials to register the NVR to that person's VMS software, being IDIS Center, for example. It's really important to grasp that the permissions that you've granted here under each of these logins will transfer to the VMS software or IDIS Center software as well. So if you register onto the guard's computer using the guard credentials that you defined here, then his access to the NVR will also be limited by the limitations that you put on here. However, if you're going to go to the guard's computer and load the NVR onto his IDIS Center software using the admin credentials above, then that guard will have admin privileges into the NVR. So it's really important that you pay attention to how or which credentials you're going to use for which particular employees or groups or functions on that computer running IDIS Center. Okay, so that's creating users and groups. We have a security function underneath that, and that is basically to use two-factor authentication. This is similar to two-factor authentication that you may use on your bank account, for example, when you're connecting to your bank via a phone, where it'll email you a code and you need to enter that code. In this case, what we do is we use the IDIS mobile application. So then that means that to use two-factor authentication, you need a mobile phone loaded with the IDIS mobile application, and this NVR has to be registered onto that mobile application software. So if you try to gain access to the NVR, it's going to automatically send a notification to the mobile phone asking you to verify that you are the user that's trying to gain access to this particular NVR. So if you need to have a higher security level on the NVR, then you can use two-factor authentication here. Enable that, set it up here. You're going to add a new user, and that's going to be the username that you create here. You create a mobile number and a hardware ID from your phone is going to be entered here, and that's how you're going to set up or register a two-factor authentication device onto the system. Right, we're not going to do that right now. The next section here is storage. This will list all the storage drives that are connected to this NVR. In my case, I only have one drive connected. It's an internal drive, a 1 terabyte capacity. It's formatted to record right now. If we add additional drives to the system, they'll appear here. If it's a new drive that was added after the initial setup of the NVR, this format column will be need to be clicked so that you can actually then set it to record, and then it'll ask you to format the drive so that you can set it up for use by the recorder. The last column here that says in use, if you click on that, you can get some information as to how much of the drive is occupied with recording and what that recording time is for this particular drive. Obviously this starts adding together when you have got multiple drives on the system, because it'll record each drive full before it goes back to drive number 1 and starts over recording on drive number 1 again. So in this case here, we've basically got a couple of months worth of recording here, and those are the dates and times involved on the one drive. Okay, on the self-diagnosis page, this is where we would create a self-diagnosis report for the NVR. If you wanted to create a report, it'll show you some information on the system, for example, the device health status, the network status, and the video inside of the NVR. Yeah, you can see the cameras that are connected to the camera side network, the speed of the ports, and which ports are connected, and so forth. Right, so that's a report that you can generate. That's an instant self-diagnosis of the system. And that's about it for the system and for the system menu on the NVR. So we're going to move to the next topic. Alright, the next menu is the camera menu. And the camera menu is where we can adjust settings on the cameras themselves, or adjust the stream settings on the camera so that we record in the right way. Before we hit the camera stream settings, I'm going to go to the camera record settings first. So on the recording settings here, we've got a section here which has got a schedule in it, and let's go to the schedule function and create a schedule for the camera recording. So by default there's only one schedule in the camera recording, and that's to record every day 24/7. If you need to create other schedules, you can do so by hitting the plus button here, but for right now we're just going to use the default recording schedule. In the mode column here, there are two icons here. One of them that we've seen before, which is the clock icon, and the clock icon stands for time-lapse recording. The little running man stands for event recording, as we can see here. So the recording options that we have is to record for time-lapse only, or to record event only, or to record, and the default setting would be to record time-lapse and event recording, or obviously no recording whatsoever if you want that in your schedule. The time-lapse and event recording means that we're always recording the camera. If there is no event in the camera, then we're recording according to the time-lapse function, and if there are events in the system, then we're recording according to the event configuration. Let's move on to see that make a little bit more sense. This is the number of channels that are under this particular schedule, so all the channels in this case. And if I go to the settings column here, this is going to ask me to define two video profiles. One is for the time-lapse recording and one is for the event recording. So this will make a little bit more sense here in a little bit. So I can choose from 4 different profiles, and these are just names. Consider these as just names that we are going to choose at this time. So in my case, I'm going to, for event recording, I'm going to choose profile number 1, and for time-lapse recording, I'm going to choose profile number 2. I could choose any profiles of those 4 here. It just makes sense to do event recording as profile number 1, because that's normally going to be your very highest resolution and your highest frame rate. So choose another one for time-lapse recording. In my case, I've chosen profile number 2. So once I've done that, that completes this setup page here on the recording schedule. I'm going to now go back to the actual, after I've done a save, I'm going to go back to camera, and under the camera menu we're going to advance now, and we're going to see under the general menu here, I can see the 4 cameras. If I need to change the camera name, I can do so here, or I can do so later on as well. We're going to go straight to where it says Stream 1. So in the Stream 1 settings, this is where we can see the camera settings, or how the network streams of the cameras have been configured. At the top you'll see camera number 1. This is obviously going to be a drop-down list where I can select all the cameras, but right now we're just working with camera 1 itself. You can see 2 sections here. The one is called the live or remote video profile. So this is the section that's used for live viewing. When we talk about viewing the camera live, it's events that are happening right now. Then there's also the recorded video profile in the second section here. Under the recorded video profile, you can see that there's 4 profiles here, profile 1, 2, 3, and 4. That should remind us of what we just did in the recording schedule setup. And then there's also the live video profile here. So in the live video profile, we can see Stream 1, Stream 2, Stream 3. These are 3 built-in streams into the camera, and we can preset what the quality of each stream is. By default, these streams in this particular camera has only got an H.264 compression codec. you can see that the top resolution here is 5 megapixel, and there's a quality setting as well, which in this case is set to 11 megabits per second. VBR or CBR means variable bitrate or constant bitrate. In most cases we're going to be working with a variable bitrate. That means that the bitrate can vary dependent on motion on the camera, brightness of the screen and colors and so forth. So in this case the bitrate will be used as variable. IPS or FPS, meaning images per second or frames per second, in this case is set at 30 for stream 1 and stream 2 and number 5. So what are these streams? Stream 1 is the highest resolution stream. Stream number 2 is set at a lower resolution, still at 30 frames a second, and stream number 3 in this case is set at also the lowest resolution but at a lower frame rate. Stream number 3 is normally used for mobile video viewing. So if you're viewing the video on your cell phone app, this is the stream that you would normally be viewing. On the computer, you would normally be viewing stream number 1 if you're viewing the picture in a full screen, but if you're viewing the picture in smaller than full screen, you'd probably be using stream number 2, which is 640 by 512. So if you were viewing the cameras in a 2x2 or a 3x3 or even a 4x4 format, you'd only be using the second one, and we'll see that in a little while. At the top here, there's something called bitrate status. So the NVR has a certain maximum capability of processing images, and that transfers into bitrate depending on resolution, the quality that you've set up, and the frames per second. You're going to define a certain bitrate for that camera stream, and the system has a certain maximum, which is then divided by all the cameras connected to the system as to the capability of each camera. If we click on the setup function here, this will become a little bit clearer, and you can see that right now at the bottom here it says that the total bitrate of 176 M or 176 megabits, the system has a maximum capability of 180 megabits per second. Okay, and that 180 has been divided into all 16 channels, and the average has been set at 11 megabits per second. So 16 multiplied by 11 is going to give you the 176. That's close to the maximum of this particular system. And how this works is that you can increase the bitrate of one particular channel. For example, in channel 1 here, I can increase the available bitrate to that channel up to 15. You can see I'm trying to go higher than 15 and it won't let me. Why? Because I've now used the maximum bitrate available on this particular NVR, which is 180 megabits per second. If I needed more than the 15 megabits per second, I would have to go and borrow from one of the other channels. Maybe a camera that doesn't need as much bitrate as this particular camera does. This particular camera needs a lot of bitrate because why? It's a H.264 5 megapixel camera. So being H.264, it requires more bandwidth than a H.265 camera. So in this case, I would like to allocate 20 megabits per second for this camera, but I cannot because I've already reached my 180 megabits per second. So I would have to go and borrow from one of the other channels. In this case, I only have 4 cameras connected to the system. So I can go to camera number 16, which does not have a camera connected to it, and I can lower that one probably all the way to 0 if I like, because I'm not going to connect a camera to that. And then I can go back to camera number 1 and increase the bitrate on camera number 1 to 20 megabits per second. Alright, so this is the setup or bitrate allocation setup that you can use to define. Now, normally, if you're only working with H.265 cameras, you probably don't need to adjust this at all, especially on a 16-channel NVR, which has a lot of available bitrate per channel. 11 megabits per second is a lot more than you'll need with most IDIS cameras even at 30 frames a second at their highest resolution. When you get into the higher resolution cameras like 12 and 8 megapixel cameras, that's the time that you should have a look, make sure that you've got the maximum resolution that you need for that particular camera. If you don't have the maximum, for example, if I go back on this camera and I go down to 11 megabits per second and apply that, if I wanted to try and increase the quality of this particular camera from 11 megabits per second to higher, you can see that that is grayed out. Any additional above 11 megabits per second is grayed out. But I know that this camera has got more quality options above this because it's an H.264 camera. So again, if I go back into the setup and I increase that to 20, apply that, and then go back to this camera quality again, you can now see that I've got more options available here to increase the quality of the camera for my stream number 1. So I can now go all the way up to very high quality, which is basically going to be about 16 megabits per second. And that's why before I was limited to 11 megabits per second. So I've increased the bitrate allocation for channel number 1 only, to be able to get my quality back to 16 megabits per second. As I said before, for most of our cameras you don't really need to do this because most of them will fall below 10 or even 8 megabits per second for the H.265 cameras. It's only if you're working with H.264 cameras of high resolution and also maybe 8 or 12 megapixel cameras, you need to just pay attention to this a little bit more. Okay, so now we've got our 3 streams under our live settings here going much better, and now we can look at the recorded profile settings. So remember, from our recording schedule we went and chose profile number 1 and profile number 2 as our 2 recording settings. Profile number 1 was for when we had motion on the screen or when we selected event recording, and profile number 2 was our time-lapse recording setting. So how do we want to record the camera? Well, we want to record when there's motion on the camera or an event on the camera. We want to record that at the highest resolution possible. So we could go and choose stream number 1 here, for example, and say that when there's an event on the system we want to record at the highest, which actually coincides with our stream number 1. So we may as well just choose stream number 1 there as our recording profile. So that's going to record at 5 megapixels, very high resolution or very high quality, 16 megabits per second, and at 30 frames a second. Then we would choose profile number 2, or we would choose the setting for profile number 2. In this case I could say I could use stream number 2, which is going to be a very low resolution, 640 by 512 at 4 megabits per second, 30 frames a second. However, I would like to record all the time at that resolution, at 5 megapixel resolution. I would just want to reduce my frame rate. So how do I do that? Well, I can go and choose a custom option here, and I could increase the resolution on my custom option to 2560 by 2048. Choose a lower quality, in this case standard would be fine, and instead of 10 frames a second I'm prepared to go down to 1 frame a second. Remember that profile 2 is recording when there is no motion on the camera, meaning if it's looking into an empty room, there's nobody in the room, this is time-lapse recording only. So why would you want to record at 30 frames a second when there's nothing happening on the camera view? 1 frame a second is enough. If anybody or any person comes into the room, the camera's motion detection, which we're going to turn on, will detect that motion, and then we'll start using profile number 1, which is, in this case we'll use stream number 1 as your recording profile, and record in very, very high resolution. Now, if you're trying to achieve a long recording time, recording at very high resolution, very high quality at 30 frames a second is going to take a lot of disk space to record that. And if you've sold this project in a particular format with recording, then you need to know that. So how do I use a lower quality and a lower frame rate than my stream number 1 setting at the top for my recording? Again, I can choose to go custom here. The two custom streams don't have to be the same, although they have to be the same resolution. But the quality and the frame rate of those two streams can be different. Of those two custom settings, shall I say, can be different. Why? Because they are not recording at the same time. Profile number 1 is recording during motion on the screen, and profile number 2 is recording when there's no motion on the screen. So they're not recording at the same time. One is they're recording alternate to each other depending on what is happening on the actual camera picture itself. So we're going to record at the high resolution for both of them. For non-motion application or time-lapse, we're going to record at standard quality, 1 frame a second, and for event recording or where there's motion on the screen, we're going to record at the high resolution at high quality, and let's say at 10 frames a second. Okay, and this will give you 9.3 megabits per second. Sorry, we want to go to high there. This will give you 8.1 megabits per second and 2 megabits per second under standard. Of course, if we want to go down to the basic resolution, we can even get that quality or the bitrate to be even lower at 1.8 megabits per second. Alright, so that's how to configure the streams, both for live and recorded video. And you would need to do this for every single camera. If you have the same camera or the same camera model, multiples of those cameras on the same recorder, then you can choose this icon at the top here, which is basically a copy icon, and it would show you the other cameras that have the same recording functions, or sorry, the same model as this particular camera, and you can select all those cameras, apply that, which will then copy that same recording settings that you set on this one to all cameras. In this case, I'm just going to hit apply, and it's going to only update camera number 1 with the settings that I had. So now we need to go and do the same thing to camera number 2. In this case, I know already what I want to do. My camera allocation in this case is enough at 6 megabits per second. I can go down to profile 1 and 2 here, set them both at custom, set them both at their highest resolution, and choose 1 frame a second here for time-lapse recording. I'm going to choose 10 frames a second for my motion or event recording, and I'm going to choose basic quality down here, and I'm going to choose high quality over there, and so there it is. And so that's the setup is done for camera number 2. I can go and check whether I have any more of these types of cameras connected to the system, and I do not. And now we can go to camera number 3. Again, I know that I'm only working with profile 1 and 2. I can ignore profile number 3 and 4. They're both H.265, both set to the highest profile here. Going to set this one to basic, this one to high, 1 frame a second and 10 frames a second. Okay, once I've got that set the way that I want it to, apply that. Okay, one thing you'll notice with an H.265 camera is we give you the opportunity to change the codec of that. Now, for recording, you would never want to change that because you always want to use the efficiency of H.265, which will use less disk recording space and also use less of a bit rate in order to record the camera. But there may be times when you want to actually have the live stream be H.264. It is possible to set the live stream at H.264 while still keeping the recorded stream at H.265. Why would you want the live stream to be at H.264? If you have a customer that has older computers, that does not have the H.265 chipset available in the computer, then you can set the live stream to be H.264 so that his computer will more easily handle live viewing of the pictures in IDIS Center software. Okay, go to my fourth camera and configure my two streams. In this case here, stream number 1, I do not have, in this case, this is a very old camera, and this camera does not have a custom option. So it's also an H.264 camera. So in this case here, I'll have to choose between the stream settings at the top, and I'm just going to choose my stream number 1 and stream number 2 as being my two recording settings for this particular camera, and click OK. Alright. So those are my camera stream settings that I need to configure, one for each camera, and one of the most important sections on the NVR to complete. So the next most important setting that you need to do on the NVR itself before we go through all the menus is to make sure that you actually set up the events. Remember that we've defined two recording profiles. One is for time-lapse recording, meaning 24/7 recording, and the other one is for event recording. So we need to make sure that we actually turn on the event recording, or turn on the events for the NVR. In this case, we're talking about motion detection on the NVR. We want to make sure that when the NVR sees motion on the camera view, that it actually starts recording in a higher resolution, or profile number 1 in this case. So let's go straight to the event side, and we're going to configure the event recording here to be turned on. So when I click on Event, Video Analytics, and go to Motion Recording, I need to make sure that I turn on the motion detection for the cameras. And we'll come back to these settings in a little while, but at least we'll make sure that we turn them on. Hit Apply, and now the motion settings are turned on for that system. Right, so after finishing in the motion detection window in the event menu, turning on the motion for all your cameras, that's kind of the third most important thing that you need to do in the NVR. So the first one was setting up the camera stream, setting up the recording streams, and then turning on the motion. I'm kind of going to skip to the last few that are critical to set up on any NVR, so that those who just want to get through this and get an NVR set up with the minimum of settings, can complete the settings as needed. So after the motion, we're going to go down to the network section and have a look at that. And the first thing I want to click on here is the WAN section. So the WAN network interface is the other NIC card, or network interface card, that exists on the NVR. Remember, the first one was for the cameras, for the camera network. So ideally you've got a separate camera network to your office network or computer network or internet connection, whatever you want to call that network. We call it the client-side network. So if you've got a separated network, this is the NIC card that is to do with the client-side network, and ultimately hopefully you will get an internet connection to the NVR so that you can connect to it remotely as well. But the client-side network is under the WAN section, and as you can see here, you've got a choice of making it a DHCP or a manual IP, so whichever way you want. Normally you're going to be connecting to your internet router, so it'll be a DHCP. It'll be getting its IP address from your DHCP server, which is your router in most cases. So in this case here, you can see the 192.168 address that I'm getting from the router, which is 192.168.0.1. Below that you have remote port. Now, Because it's a network device, you've always got an IP address and a remote port number. So these two are very, very important as in the connectivity to the device from outside software. So when we're using the IDIS Center software, we need to know what this IP address is, and we need to know the remote port number. We need to make sure that each of these IDIS devices, if you have multiple NVRs, that they have different remote port numbers. By default, our port number is 8016, as you can see there. But you need to make sure that if you are using multiple NVRs, that you change the port number for the other NVR. So make one 8016, 8017, 8018, etc. if you're installing multiple of them. It does have a use UPnP option. UPnP is Universal Plug and Play. If that is checked, it's going to try and negotiate with your router. If your router has got UPnP enabled, it will try and negotiate with your router to open up this port number in your router. What opening the port means is that the port number 8016 is forwarded in the router to this internal IP address of 192.168.0.214. If an inquiry comes over the internet into your router, your internet router, and it asks for access to internal IP address 8016, that'll be forwarded to this NVR, and this NVR will respond with the necessary video that inquiry is asking for. You also see that you have a code here on the right hand side, so you can use this with your mobile application, IDIS Mobile, to add this device into your IDIS Mobile if you're only working on the local network, meaning that if your mobile device will only have access to this device, to this NVR, when you're on the local Wi-Fi established by this gateway or by this router. If you want access from the internet, meaning from a remote location not on the local network, then of course you'll need the public IP and the remote port number of this, and that's the way that you'll use to register this device in your IDIS Mobile software. All of that is a little bit complicated, and it's much easier to use a feature called FEN. So you'll see on the menu here on the left hand side we have a feature called FEN. FEN stands for every network. And what it means is it's just an easy way to not have to remember the public IP and the port number. And it's kind of like a DNS server, but it does a little bit more than that. Our FEN server is on the internet. And if you register this device to the FEN server with a FEN name, you'll remember that I entered a FEN name before that says test LS. And I checked that, and it said that that name was available. We also have a QR code here if you want to register the device on your IDIS Mobile using this, using the FEN name, then you'll use this QR code that's on this page. But once I've got this FEN name entered here and registered, I can then use that name to register this NVR into either IDIS Center software that's running on a PC or into the IDIS Mobile software on a smartphone, both Android and iOS. Right, we'll kind of see that in operation when we look at the video on IDIS Center, and then we'll see that we'll use this to register it, but that's the name that you're going to use anyway to register it to IDIS Center software or IDIS Mobile. Okay, and that's the use FEN section that we're looking at there. So once you've set up the WAN IP and the FEN name, you can now get external contact to this device from the internet or from a computer on the network. We know that the device is recording. We know that the motion has been turned on. We're recording in both motion detection, or what we call event recording, and also 24/7 that we also call time-lapse recording. So both in time-lapse and event recording, we're recording in two different, sometimes we're recording in two different resolutions, or at least just in two different bit rates, so that we have a high bit rate when there's motion on the camera and a much lower bit rate when there's no motion on the camera. Those are the most important functions to have set up inside the NVR. So just very, very quickly again, we're going to register cameras. We're going to come into the recording settings here. We're going to look at schedule, and we're going to set up our two profiles for recording, time-lapse and event recording. In this case, I picked profile 1 and profile 2. And where they come into the picture is through camera and stream 1 settings in the camera. And these are the two profiles here. There's 4 profiles available. We only need 2 of them. In this case, I picked profile 1 and 2. Those are the 2 profiles that we're using to record with. So that's been set, and then we've also turned on our motion detection. Right here under video analytics and motion, we've made sure that our camera's motion detection is turned on. And the last thing was to set the network up on the WAN side and also enter a FEN name. So again, those are the most important things. If you're just looking for a shortcut on how to set up the NVR very, very quickly, those are kind of the most important things that you need to take care of. And now we're going to go back and go through every menu item, and just to make sure that if you need those functions, that you know how to set them up. Alright, so I'm going to go back to the camera menu. We've already taken care of stream 1 settings, and we know what that's all about. Under the general settings, as we talked about before, this is where you can change the camera name if you want to. Instead of just having cam 1, cam 2, cam 3, you can name the camera name. If you click in that field there, then you'll get a keyboard that'll pop up, and you can type in whatever name you want to type in there. The use column of this normally puts the camera in a normal mode, but we also have 2 other options there, which are covert 1 and covert 2. So what is covert 1 and covert 2? It's just to do with the permissions of the users. This is another way of restricting who can see a camera and who cannot see a camera. There's a more advanced way of doing this, and as we saw that in the system menu earlier on, if I go to the system menu and I go to users, when I create a user group and add a user group like this, that's very strange. I add a group called guards. Beneath that there's camera hidden, and if you want to hide cameras from this group, this is where you would check them. Okay, that is a way to hide cameras from specific users. So previous to that, we had this covert 1 and covert 2. What it means is that this particular camera under covert 1 will be hidden from view. In other words, you just will not see any video. If I go back to the main screen, that will give me a way to explain to you. Under covert 1, this camera 2 would be no video. You wouldn't see any video here, but you would see these icons here, and you would see the camera name, camera 2 or lobby camera or whatever, however you want to name this. So I would be aware that there is a camera there, but the view of the camera is hidden from me as the user. The other option for covert 2, I would not see the camera view, and I would also not see the camera name. It would look as if there was a blank or no camera existing, something like this. I would just see cam 6 and nothing. There would be no icons or anything like that. So that is what covert 2 is. Those are for really special circumstances. Probably when you're just trying to hide cameras from certain users, the best way is to set that up in the user menu under general, as we just saw. Okay. Then under advanced setup in the camera menu, there's a lot of options here. First of all, privacy masking allows me to blank out some of the camera view. You might have seen under the fisheye camera that there's a black square on this fisheye camera, and this is privacy masking. I can draw a black square on any camera or multiple black squares, on the camera, and this blacks out the video from that source. So even if I do de-warping, for example, and I try and view video in that area, you'll see that that area is completely blanked off from view. I cannot view the video on that particular area at all. Let me use EPTZ here, and you'll be able to see that a little bit better. As I move the picture around, when I get to that particular area, you can see that that area is blocked out. Now that's normally for, you know, a camera that's either looking at somebody's window, looking at somebody's desk that doesn't really want to be on camera, or a bathroom entrance or something like that. Something where you need to have some privacy, and you can do that on the camera itself. Let me get out of here. Back to the advanced setup menu. So that's privacy masking. If you want to set it up, basically just click on there, enable the privacy masking for this particular camera, set it up, and you can have multiple masks, as I said, and all you would do is just draw a square on the screen, and that would be area number 1, for example. I'll draw another area in front of this window, and that'll be area number 2. If I right click then and say save, that's I've got 2 privacy masking areas. If I wanted to name them, I could. Otherwise, just hit apply, and now I should have 2 masked off areas within that camera view. So there you see the 2 black areas that are masked off. Alright, so back to the camera and advanced settings again. The next column is for PTZ cameras. This is for a full PTZ camera that has zoom, pan and tilt functionality, and this is where I would set some of those PTZ parameters. So I'll just show you here. If I click on there, you've got preset, scan, patterns and tour, and then you've got some default settings of the camera here. For example, the home position, where's the position you want it to go home to, whether you want to auto run any of the scan or patterns or tours, which way to auto pan, either clockwise or so, and whether you want to auto flip the camera. So just for an example, a common thing that you may do is set up a PTZ preset. If I try and move this camera downwards, for example, okay, and then set that up as a preset, I would just say set this up and type in a name here. I'll just put wall. That's one preset, and we'll just set one more preset just a little bit off from that. Just there, for example, and set that up as preset number 2. Okay, so that helps me to set up preset positions. So those are 2 different presets. And now if I wanted to do, for example, a tour, I can click on there and I can add a tour position here and say for your first position I want you to go to preset number 2, for example, and stay there for 5 seconds. And then go to preset number 1 and stay there for 5 seconds or 6 seconds. Then I would give this a name, just say tour 1, for example. And a tour would just, as is obvious, just cause the camera to go from one preset position to the other and just alternate between those 2 every 5 seconds. It's just a very simple way. So that's just how to set up a tour, and then a pattern and a scan is kind of obvious. A pattern we just follow what you did with the mouse cursor, how you drag the camera around from one area to the other, up and down and pan around, and that pattern would follow whatever you did with the mouse cursor. Alright, so these are PTZ specific settings, only for true PTZ cameras, so we don't need to spend too much time on that. The next function on this menu that's important is at the end here. You'll see that there's a reset column. You've got some options for resetting cameras depending on what type of cameras they are. If they're IDIS cameras under direct IP control, then you've got all the settings available, meaning PoE reset, a soft reset, and a factory reset. A PoE reset would just turn the power to the camera off and on again. A soft reset would reset the camera internally, and then a factory reset would completely factory default the camera to original settings. Doesn't matter too much on direct IP cameras, because as we know, they don't use usernames or passwords or IP addresses, so doing a factory reset on there basically just refreshes it, but it would still stay registered onto the NVR as such. You have to be a little bit careful if you factory reset a camera that's in IDIS mode or a third-party camera, because you'll clear all the IP settings and of course usernames and password, and then the registration information between the NVR and that camera would be broken. So you'd probably want to first remove that camera from the NVR, then factory reset it, and then re-register it onto the actual NVR itself. Okay, so that's the reset menu. And then the very most useful and unique feature on the advanced setup menu is the ability to configure cameras using the NVR. So this is a very advanced feature. For example, if I click on this video column here for the camera, you can see that this brings up the camera and also brings up the settings of the camera. So for those who haven't worked with IDIS product before, usually a camera setting is done on a browser connected to a PC, or on a PC connected to the camera. So you bring up your browser, you use a scan tool that's given to you by the manufacturer of that camera. You scan for the camera, it finds the IP, you open up a browser, you log into the camera with your username and password, with your PC that's on the same network as the camera, and then you get a camera configuration menu similar to what you see here. So here we're doing it without you needing a PC. We're doing it with the NVR that's connected to the camera, and we're opening up that camera menu, meaning that I can go here and I can change the IR strength of the camera, for example. I can turn on the pivot mode and so forth. If I go to the top here, this is the image sensor settings. If I go to day-night settings, I can change the day-night settings. I can turn black and white mode on, for example. So these are all camera-specific settings that I'm reaching through the NVR, which is very, very useful, and it saves a lot of time for maintenance and for making small changes in the thing, that you don't have to have a PC and go and set those cameras. So again, these are IDIS cameras only, and only cameras normally in the direct IP mode that we're able to do this with. So you can do this, you can change the exposure settings, which is obviously where your WDR settings are found as well. Turn that on and off, and then white balance and so forth as well. Alright, so this is a very, very powerful setting, kind of hidden away, but it's in the advanced setup menu under the video column. If I click OK here, it's under this video column. For a third-party camera, this will probably not be available, but for all IDIS cameras, we have this capability of changing camera settings from the NVR. Okay, so now we've taken care of the general, the advanced setup, and also Stream 1 settings. The next one I want to just touch on is the audio settings. All of our cameras have audio capability. Most of the cameras just have an audio in and an audio out function. So audio in will be line in, meaning that you need to provide a microphone of some type with a line in output or line output into the camera, If you want audio out of the camera location, then you need to connect an amplified speaker to the camera, and then using either the NVR or more commonly using the IDIS Center software, you can enable a microphone on the computer that you're using and then speak out to the camera location. So you can make announcements at the camera location using that microphone and the audio out at the camera location. If you want a microphone on the camera itself that you can listen to on the computer, then you need to connect a microphone to the camera using the line-in output. Some of our cameras have a built-in microphone. Normally the fisheye cameras and some of the new dome cameras also have built-in audio. If they have built-in audio, this is the menu where you come to enable that built-in audio. Remember, in a lot of states you have to get permission to record somebody audio, so it's not turned on by default. So if you go to the audio menu and you go to the camera, for example this second camera here, you'll see that it's got audio in, and it's got the device as being the microphone, which is the built-in microphone. Normally you would have just line in there, but if you want to make use of the internal microphone, you click on microphone, set up the volume, and make sure you've got audio in checked there, and then get out of this menu, and as you see that is configured. So when you're using IDIS Center software, you'll be able to see and you'll be able to listen to this microphone from the software, IDIS Center software that you're running on the computer. If you want to record the audio, go to the record menu and make sure that you check the record audio button, otherwise it's not going to record that video. You have to make sure that you enable to record audio. Back to the camera menu, there's a couple of options here for SD card. If you have an SD card connected to the camera or inserted into the camera, most of our cameras have an SD card option. If you want to insert an SD card into the camera, you can put it on here, or come to this menu and you can format the SD card from here and turn recycle on and off. That means it's going to record over itself. The SD card in the camera can be used to record video onto that SD card. More commonly, we're going to use a special feature that we'll see here in a little bit, which is called our SD card recording, but we'll see it here under the record menu, which is called Smart Failover. So when we get to that option, we'll see a better option of using our SD card in the camera. Okay, and if we want to upgrade the camera on the NVR, you can put the upgrade firmware on the USB flash drive and insert it into the NVR. Come to this upgrade menu and basically just click on the last column here to upgrade, and it'll find the media or the flash card in the USB port and show you all the firmwares that you have. You'll pick the right one for that particular camera and then perform the upgrade via the button at the bottom right hand side. So you can either upgrade the camera directly on the NVR using the flash drive, or as we'll see in the next video, you can use the IDIS Center software already on the PC to upload firmware to the camera from the software. Alright, so that's taken care of the camera menu, all the options inside the camera menu. So now we'll move on and just see what we missed out on the recording menu. From the recording menu, we've already visited the schedule function, where we set up the two profiles that we wanted to use in the camera setup. So we'll have a look at the general section here. Under general, recycle, which means do we want to record over the hard drives once they're full. We've looked at record audio. Do we want to record audio for sure? And then do we want to auto delete all the footage on the recording drive? Normally we wouldn't do that, but if you wanted to set that up, you could do that. And then for panic recording, do we want to use panic recording? Remember, that's going to record all the cameras under the highest resolution profile. A lot of people hit that exclamation mark by mistake. Then they wonder why they're not getting the full recording time that they specified with their hard drives, it's because they're recording 24/7 in the highest resolution. So unless you're using the NVR specifically for a guard to use as a monitoring station, you probably want to uncheck use panic recording and apply that so that nobody can hit the button by mistake. Alright, the next section we want to talk about is the pre-event section. In pre-event is only really used when you are recording event mode only. Remember, we talked about the 3 ways of recording. You could record event only, time-lapse only, or time-lapse and event. We chose to record in time-lapse and event, but some people really want to record only the events on their system. They don't want to record 24/7. They only want to record if there is motion or some kind of another event on the system. This is normally okay, but care should be taken so that you don't miss anything. Let's say that you have a camera with a narrowish view of a driveway. If some vehicle comes into that driveway and then exits the driveway, it's possible that the vehicle could be exiting the driveway before the camera really responds to the motion detection of that particular camera and starts recording. So it's a good idea to configure pre-event recording if you are recording only in event mode, and you would then select the camera that you want to set and choose a video profile and then choose a time, 5, 10 or 15 seconds that you want to record prior to the actual event happening. That's going to mean that the camera is actually recording 5 seconds of video all the time, and when an event happens, that 5 seconds of video will remain on there, plus the event time of the actual motion event or whatever other type of event it was. So again, this is important to do if you're recording event only mode. Then you would want to enable the pre-event recording at the same time. Smart failover is what we talked about a little while ago. When you're adding an SD card into the NVR, when you're adding an SD card into a camera, if you use it as a smart failover, that would show you here where you have some recording. So what is smart failover? Smart failover is kind of a standby or a backup recording to the NVR recording, and what you would do with smart failover is normally have a camera that's got very important recording that you don't want to lose in case you lose connection to the NVR. So you would power that camera off a switch or some other kind of a PoE source, have the SD card inside there and set it to smart failover. When or if the camera loses network connection to the NVR, the camera will start recording on its own into the SD card, and if that lasts for 10 minutes or an hour or 24 hours, you'll get continuous recording on the SD card. And if the connection between the camera and the NVR is then restored, the camera will then continue recording on the NVR. But obviously, in the timeline of the hard disk on the NVR, you'll have a gap in the recording. Well, smart failover will then take the recording that's on the SD card and in the background start filling in the recording on the hard disk drive of the actual NVR. Start filling that recording in until it's completed, and the user will not be aware that that has happened, except if you go to the playback, you will see a green section on your timeline, your recording timeline, indicated that that has been replaced by the SD card recording, or has come from the SD card recording. So that's a smart failover feature. Very, very useful in case you have a very, very important camera and you can use the SD card intelligently in that way. Right, the next section we're going to cover is the event section. We've had a little bit of a look at the events themselves, which was the motion detection. So motion detection is one of the video analytic features that comes with the NVR. We call that video analytics, meaning that it's looking at the video and trying to decipher if there's motion on the system or not. We'll start here with system events at the top under events, and these are events that could occur mostly from housekeeping of the NVR itself, meaning the disk temperature, the smart or disk smart features, if you've got a bad hard disk, or if you've got a disk almost full, or if your machine is shut down or booting up or restarting. All these events, if they happen, you can set an action for that. Meaning, for example, let's say disk temperature is 70 degrees C. If you exceed that temperature, you can set an action for the NVR to do something, to either send out an alert or to beep when this event has happened. So let's look, for example, at the disk temperature. If the temperature exceeds 70 degrees C, or whatever temperature you set in the configuration here, we can click on the action column and we can see that we can set some type of an action to happen. First of all, we can set an alarm out. Now, what is an alarm out? If we click on that column, then we can see the alarm output for all the cameras, and we can also see that the NVR has an alarm output and a beeper. So the NVR has a relay contact at the back of the NVR that we can make use of. So we could turn that relay on based on a disk temperature. Maybe that'll go to some kind of an alert system or a bell or something like that, or a flashing light somewhere where the maintenance personnel can see it. Or we can just make the NVR beep. This is obviously good if it's in a room of some kind that's monitored, but obviously if it's somebody's home, you probably don't want to turn the beeper on. So these are two of the alarm outputs that you could activate because of an event. But we also have notification events, so we could also send out a notification of some kind. The notifications that are available are email, so we can send out an email because of the internal event of the NVR. There are some LAN notifications here as well. What these notifications are is, we call these callback features. So the LAN designates a computer on the LAN that is running the IDIS Center software. So think about it this way: you could have, let's say, two computers. One is with the guards who are monitoring the video for security events, and you could also have a maintenance workshop or an IT department that's responsible for taking care of the NVR. Well, you can pick here which computer you want to send these events to. Obviously, this is not a security event. This is a disk temperature event, which is more of interest to the maintenance personnel. So you would choose to send that notification specifically to the maintenance computer that's running IDIS Center software, and they'll receive a pop-up or an alert window on their PC. If it's a security type event, then you could put in the IP address there of another computer, which is maybe the guard's computer, and the security event would pop up there. So that's what these notifications are under the LAN section, which again we call callbacks as well. The push notification is a notification to a cell phone that's running the IDIS mobile software, or the IDIS Mobile Plus software, again being either Android or iOS. And as long as this NVR is registered on that software, they'll receive a push notification to say that the disk temperature has exceeded 70 degrees in this case. And the other thing is just to activate an alert window. This is on this particular NVR. Again, only if this NVR is being used as a monitoring station would that be any use. It'll pop up a window to say that there's a disk temperature alert. So different types of notifications that you can send out depending on the needs and what type of environment you've got. And these notifications are available for all the event types. So all these system events that are seen here, some of them that you can configure. You can also configure an action for that and make the NVR perform some kind of an action or a notification because this event has occurred. So those are the system events, internal system events. Of course, we can also get camera system events. and these are the system events under the camera. We could have an audio detection. So in audio detection is where we can use the microphone of the camera as an audio detection device. So oftentimes the camera is just looking at one area of a room, for example, which may not be a window. It may not be able to see a window, but we could use the microphone of the camera to actually detect audible noise in the room when there shouldn't be any noise, and use that as an event trigger. So let's say the camera is looking at the door of the room, but there's a window behind it that gets broken. We could actually make the camera send out an alert because it's detected audio within the room. So that's what audio detection is all about. If we want to enable audio detection, for example, I know camera 2 has got a microphone on it. We can set the sensitivity here for that event, and also the activation time. How long does the audio have to last in order to be detected? So that would be your activation time. And then again, what action do you want to perform because the camera audio has been triggered? Again, we've got the same list of actions that can be performed and some more. So we can record different cameras. In this case, we're going to record the same camera that detected the audio noise. We can also have an alarm output, the same as we discussed before. We've got the alarm output on the NVR or the beeper on the NVR. We can send a notification, just as we talked about before. That can be an email notification, or it can be a callback, or a push notification, or an alert window that can be brought up. We can also turn a PTZ camera different to this camera. We can turn that PTZ camera to a certain preset. Remember, on camera number 4 we set up 2 presets. We could tell the PTZ to go to a specific preset, like ceiling or wall, that we set up there. So if you have 2 cameras that have, or if you have a PTZ camera that has an overall view of this room, you can turn that PTZ camera into this room and monitor it that way. Okay, so these are the actions that are available for the audio detection, and that's the explanation of audio detection itself. The next camera event that we have is something called camera fan error. Those are only for cameras with built-in fans, so we don't have any available right now. Video loss is also a very common problem on a camera. It has some kind of a video loss for a certain time. So let's say it loses the video for 20 seconds or whatever time you set here, 5 minutes or 30 seconds or 1 minute, etc., and then you can perform the same action on that. So if there's a video loss lasting longer than 20 seconds, we want to send a notification or an email, what have you, to a specific user and be notified of the video loss on the camera. Recording failure is another event for a camera system. So if the camera stops recording for a certain time, remember, video loss could be a lens problem on the camera or an internal failure that it stops receiving video onto its sensor. Recording failure means that the camera is still working okay, but it's not recording on the NVR for some reason. So that's another type of event for a camera system, and we can again have an activation time here and the same set of actions that we had before. We can define an action for this and send an email or a push notification because we have a recording failure. Some cameras have a built-in PIR. PIR is kind of the motion detection and a white light on the camera. So not a motion detection of the actual video itself, it's detecting motion in the space, just like a PIR detector or an alarm sensor that you may have in a room. So some cameras have that built in. We don't have one of those cameras here, but if you do have that, you can set the sensitivity and the actions for that as well. Alright, so those are the camera system type events. The next type of events that we can have is a video analytic event, and we've looked at one of them already, which was the motion detection. These are the other types of video analytic type events that we have. So let's have a look at motion detection once more. earlier we enabled the motion detection on these cameras by making sure that the box is checked. And then we have a sensitivity here. What is sensitivity? Well, sensitivity is out of a total of 5, either to make it more dull or more sensitive. And also you can set different sensitivities for daytime and nighttime. The next box is actually defines where on the camera the motion detection will take place. So for example, if I go here, you can see this is the camera view, and all these little blocks mean that where there's a block, motion detection will take place. Well, if I have a fan in a room or a TV that's on constantly, I don't want to detect the motion from those events, or even from a window that's looking out onto a roadway. That would be a good time to come and trim the area that's detecting motion. So for example, if I took that area there and cleared that area, then no motion in this top part of the picture here would set off the motion alarm. Only events that happened in the bottom half of the picture would set off event alarms. So that's by using these dots and by designating which areas I want motion to be triggered from. The more that you adjust these settings and get these settings properly configured, the less false alarms you will have on a camera, which means the less recording time you'll have on a camera, which means the longer recording time available for the NVR. So it's really important to set these areas properly and not just accept the whole camera view as triggering motion. It's also important to understand what is going to trigger the motion even though the block is existing. So for example, if you look down this camera view, you'll see the garage door there, and the human being standing there would be about 6 or 8 blocks in size, standing at the garage door. So if you wanted that to be activated, you need to make sure that your detection is going to look for at least 8 blocks that needs to be activated in order to cause an alarm condition. So right now we've just selected the area that we want to detect in. So if I click OK for that, you'll see that the next section says minimum blocks. So if I go to the minimum block section, now I know from my previous calculation that it takes about 8 blocks at the garage door to create an alarm condition. So currently the minimum blocks are set to 1 block only. Well, so if a human is 8 blocks, that'll definitely trigger the alarm every time it sees a human, but a smaller moving object might also trigger that alarm. So the right thing to do here is to say the maximum or the minimum size of a human in the area that I want to detect in is going to be 8. I'm going to make this 6. So by doing that, I know that a human being will still trigger the system alarm, but smaller objects, I don't know, maybe a small cat or a small dog or something like that, probably will not trigger the system, and so I can filter out some of the unwanted alarms that I might not want. And that's kind of how you look at that. So it's both the zone and the number of blocks is the correct way to set up the motion detection on the actual camera itself. And now again, I can use the actions and I can set up an action for that. So when there is a motion detection, what do I want to do? Do I want to just record? Do I want to turn the beeper of the NVR on? Do I want to send a LAN notification? Do I want to send a push notification? How do I want to act to that motion detection alarm? Of course, when I'm using the IDIS Center software, I'll be able to see that motion happening on there. It'll come in as a video or a red bar on top of the video, and I'll be able to know that I had a motion detection on that camera. But any extra notifications that you want to send, those will be defined here at the bottom. Okay, so that's kind of how to configure the motion detection events. I'll just hit apply here. By the way, ignoring interval at the bottom here means between alarm events. So every time a person comes into the camera view, the system will detect the motion of that person walking into the view. But once he's created an alarm, it's still looking at the whole room in order to see if there's motion. So the same person could set off multiple motion alarms within the same event. If you don't want those multiple events, you can adjust the ignoring time, which means once he's created an event once, it's going to take another 5 seconds or 3 seconds or whatever you set there before the system activates another event for the same person. Okay, the next type of video analytic event is a trip zone. Trip zone works a little bit differently to the motion events, although it still uses the same block arrangement. If I activate, for example, the trip zone, and let's use camera number 3, I guess, and I go to the zone on this one, what's going to happen here is I could do something like this. I could take all the blocks on the right hand side off, clear them. So the difference between the motion detection and the trip zone is in the motion detection, it's going to detect motion in any area that has a block on it. In the trip zone, it's going to detect any crossing of that motion from an area with blocks into an area with no blocks, or the other way around, area with no blocks into blocks. So I could draw this any which way I wanted to. I could do it like this. It means any item on anybody on the right hand side walking around on the right hand side will not set off a motion until he crosses into the left hand side, and the same for somebody on the left hand side crossing into the right hand side. I could achieve probably the same effect by deleting all but one line of the motion blocks. Something like that, which would mean somebody walking from the left crossing this line, or somebody walking from the right crossing the line, will set off the motion alarm. So either way, whichever way I wanted to use the motion detection, the trip direction, I can come here and set the direction to in or out, or in and out, which is probably the most useful way. Set OK, and so that has now configured my tripwire or my trip zone detection. And again, for each of these, I can set up a different action as well. So I can set up whatever type of action I want, whether it be alarm output, sending email notifications, turning PTZs, or simply just recording the camera. Alright, the next video analytic section is going to be tampering. Under tampering, what tampering means is somebody is obscuring the view of the camera. You could do this by placing a paper bag over the camera, or spray painting the camera lens, or simply turning the lights off in the room. But if the camera has IR lights, then turning off the lights isn't going to do too much, because the camera will still have a view. But obscuring the camera view by putting a bag over it or spray painting the lens will result in a tampering event. In the tampering section, if you want to turn that on, make sure that you turn that on by checking the box, choosing a sensitivity, choosing an activation time. How long do you want to wait before the alarm is created by somebody blocking the camera? And then again, you can set whatever action you want to define because of that tampering event. Okay, loitering and line crossing and object detection are video analytic type events that are dedicated to a special range of cameras, which are our 6000 series of cameras. So that's not going to be covered here, but they have special analytics in them for loitering and line crossing and object detection. So again, let us know if you're using one of those cameras, and we can assist you with setting those cameras up. Right, there are some additional events like alarm input, text input, ANPR, and alarm box loss. So we have an alarm input on every camera, as well as an alarm output, meaning that every camera, or most cameras, have a relay contact output. It also has a alarm contact input, that you can read some dry contacts with the input of the camera. So in that way you can use, as you can see here, for every camera. So if I go to camera number 3, activate that, I can give it a source, meaning where's the alarm coming from, and it's coming from the camera itself. And channel number 3 in this case, which is my camera. And what is the normal type of connection? Is it normally open or normally closed? Meaning whatever contact you're reading, which is the normal condition of that contact. The condition means that do you want to tie this event to any other event, meaning that you could say that if that alarm clock happens at the same time as you have a motion event on another camera or even the same camera, then you want to produce the alarm output for that. And then you can choose an action as well. So this is a way of using the alarm contact input into the camera or even in the NVR and producing some kind of an output result for that in your actions. On the text in function, it's also something we're not really going to cover in this video. All our NVRs are capable of reading text in, meaning an ASCII text coming from a receipt printer or some kind of an ASCII source that we can read, and then that ASCII text is then searchable. So originally this was done for receipt printers, meaning that you could read the receipt text of all the receipts, let's say in a convenience store, and then later you can go and search for video that contains transactions for, I don't know, Marlboro cigarettes and a Coca-Cola. It'll bring up all the transactions where those items were purchased, and you can view the video associated with those types of text in inputs. So we won't be looking at that right now, or even the ANPR. The ANPR is automatic number plate recognition, and so we can also connect a number plate or an LPR system that uses the text in function, and that is also what we use for the ANPR. So not something we can look at in this video, but again, if you have those functionalities and you need to set that up, contact us and we'll help you out to set that up. An alarm box is another box that we manufacture that has additional alarm inputs and outputs, and this is basically just a connection for that. If you lose connection with the alarm box, either for 20 seconds or longer, you can then have an action set to that. And then the VA box is another box that we manufacture as well for retail type video analytics, and again, we're not going to have a look at that box right now, or the setup for that box. That's for a subject for another video. Right, so that's kind of the event section. We've completed the event section. We've completed 4 sections on the NVR. Right, the next menu we're going to look at is the device menu. So in the device menu, these are devices, or what we call devices, in the actual NVR itself. So it really has a couple. The alarm output of the NVR is what we call a device. Right, so every camera has a relay on board that we can use as an output device, and the NVR also has an output device or a relay. These are the cameras. As you can see, the source here is the camera. And then if we go right to the end, we also see that device number 17 in this case is the NVR alarm output number 1. And we can also reverse that relay. In other words, make it, instead of being a normally closed or normally open, we can reverse the functionality of that relay. We can set up a schedule, and in most cases, all the relays are going to be in the same schedule because of events, but you could schedule relays to only work at certain times. Let's say you were locking a gate with a relay after hours. You can make sure that that relay closed only after hours and in that case, instead of being driven by an event, it would be driven on or off based on the actual schedule. And that would be it. So if you wanted to use the alarm output of the relay for some kind of an event, you can configure that here. The remote control is really for RS-232 or 485 control of the NVR, so this is not a subject for this video, and neither is the VA box or the alarm box. As I discussed before, we manufacture these other two boxes that can be used with the NVR, but the setup of them is going to be a subject for another video. So that's really all for the device section. Let's move on to the network section. We've really had a look at the network section already. We had a look at the WAN section, which was again the NIC card or the network interface card for the office network, or what we call the client network for the device, where it would get its internet connection if you had one, or at least where it would connect to office computers running the IDIS Center software. So this is the NIC card. We have the IP settings here, and we talked about the remote port and using UPnP. There is also a ping test on this page. If you ran the ping test, you could put in an IP address here that you want to try and ping to. Remember that this is connected to the office side network or the client side network on your NVR, and then you could do a run test here, and it would try and ping the actual device that you're pinging. In this case here, you can see that my ping received a reply from my router. Okay, in the FEN section we looked at as well how to define a name for the FEN connection or for the device to be registered on the FEN server. This next section here that says fen.idisglobal.com, don't change that. That is the address for our FEN server and the port number for our FEN server. So these are not things that you need to change, because if you change them, then they won't be able to connect to our FEN server at all. So do not change those items. That's really all it is for FEN. If we go to the general section under network here, we can see the bitrate here is 50 megabits per second. So what is that? The NVR itself has got limited capabilities in throughput, and we already looked earlier when we did the camera configuration that we had 180 megabits per second available for this particular NVR for the recording of the cameras, and that is the camera throughput. We also have 50 megabits per second available for bitrate for the live connections to the NVR, for the remote connections to the NVR, meaning when you're playing live video on a computer or a mobile phone using IDIS Center or IDIS Mobile, this is the bitrate that you have available to play all those videos and for all client connections. So it doesn't seem like a lot, but 50 megabits per second is quite a lot, and we'll have a look at a way that we can actually increase that 50 megabits per second here in a little bit. So the other sections are things that you would configure with your router, so it's again not a subject for discussion here. Direct NDC is a way of remote connecting to the actual NVR, and this is where we would turn this on. This is basically a VNC connection for those who know a little bit about remote connecting or remote desktop. This is using a VNC connection, so this is the way that you would actually be able to open a remote desktop from a computer running IDIS Center using the VNC connection. So again, this is another port that needs to be opened, and it's a security risk under some circumstances. So it's probably not something you want to enable all the time, but it's something that you can come in remotely and enable for a remote desktop session. Once you finish the session, you can disable it again. So if you enable it, you need to come and create a password, confirm that password, so that when you use the VNC connection from the outside computer, you'll be able to enter that password. establish your remote desktop connection, and then disconnect and come in here and turn off the direct NDC connection again. We'll discuss this more when we're looking at the IDIS Center software configuration, but just to let you know where the setting for use direct NDC, which is actually a VNC, is found. Okay, so that's under the general section. Under IDIS Web, this is also a little bit of an advanced section, but there is a way of viewing the recorded video remotely on a computer without needing to install IDIS Center software. So this is to be run on a web browser, Internet Explorer web browser. If you want to use that functionality, then we have to enable the IDIS web service. As you can see, it uses another remote port, so this is again an additional port that needs to be opened or forwarded for the remote service or for the web service to work, and that is again an additional risk, opening an additional port. So it's not enabled by default, but if you need to enable that, if your customer needs to be able to use a web browser to view the video from the NVR, then this needs to be enabled from here, and this is where you would enable it. For our purpose, we're just going to keep that disabled. Okay, the FEN section we've already talked about. NetFS is actually a FTP service. For those of you who know what an FTP service is, this is a way to either load firmware or even to send a video clip to an FTP service for retrieval later via a computer. So again, not a subject we're going to use for this discussion. RTSP is another protocol that can be used for the NVR to gain access to video streams directly. This is normally used by access control systems who may want to display the video of a certain camera in conjunction with, let's say, a door control or something like that. This is the way that they can gain access to particular video streams through the RTSP protocol from the NVR. And remember, when we looked at the user section, we have to specifically enable the user to be able to gain RTSP streams. So remember that RTSP has to be turned on per user. If you're going to be using it, then you would enable it here and then set up the correct port numbers for that RTSP connection. Again, more of an advanced topic that we're not going to really talk about much here. The NVR also has a built-in firewall. Again, a more advanced topic that not everybody's going to be using. But if you want to use firewall service, you should know how firewalls are configured, and you would add firewall rules onto this. This means that the NVR will act as a firewall, and only certain computers, either on the local network or on other networks, would be able to connect with the NVR. Even if they have the right software and the right credentials, we still have to pass the firewall. So for this, you need to know a little bit about firewalls and how they work. We've got rules that you can set up, and then actions for those rules, you either to drop or accept or reject. And if you know a little bit about firewall, you first have to set up all the rejections, and then followed by that there would be rules for the computers that you want to accept. So you first reject everybody, then you accept certain computers only or certain MAC addresses only. And again, this is a more advanced topic that we're not going to cover under this particular video. Alright, so that's really the network section done. In the notification section, we're going to be looking at that. Remember, notifications are part of the actions that we can set up, either for events or camera type events or system events or motion events and video analytic events. We've got actions that we can set up, and part of those actions are the notifications. So in the notifications section here, this is where we would actually set up the mechanism of those notifications. So for emails, this is where we would set up the email server. For push notifications or callbacks, this is where we would set up the IP addresses and etc. etc. So if we go to the notifications section, we can see that we've got a schedule here at the top. If you wanted to only schedule or enable certain notifications to be able to work at certain times of the day or certain parts of the week only, this is where you would then define separate schedules for them. In most cases, we're just going to allow all the notifications to be operative every day of the week, 24/7. So the first type of notification is a callback. We discussed this. Remember, this was the IP address of a computer that's running IDIS Center software that we want to send specific notifications to. We talked about maintenance personnel getting the notifications for, let's say, a hard drive over temperature, but guards getting the notification for a motion event on a camera. So this is where you would send those notifications to those specific PCs, and you would then type in the IP address, and the port number 8201 is the default port configured in the software, IDIS Center software as well. So unless you change that port number in the software, you don't want to come and change the port number here either. Okay, this will send the notification directly to IDIS Center, and when we look at the IDIS Center software, we'll see more clearly of how this notification or where this notification is received, and we can add up to 5 different IP addresses here, or 5 different callback receivers or callback clients. Okay, the next one is mail. If we want to use email as the notification receiver or client, then we have to set up the SMTP server. You have to have an SMTP server set up on your network, and this is where we would then define the address and set up the SMTP server. Be very careful when using a commercial email like Gmail or Yahoo or something like that to be your SMTP client. If you have a lot of events that happen, that'll be sending multiple emails of the same kind to that email address, and a lot of the ISPs will filter out and try and block an email from coming from a source that's sending multiple emails of the same type, and so you might find yourself blacklisted very, very quickly. You need to be careful on what type of events you set up and make sure that those events are properly configured, not to send multiple events for no reason whatsoever. Or the next notification is the push notification, and yeah, there's really no settings required. This goes to a push server that IDIS runs, receives the push notification, and then passes that on to either the Android server or the iOS push notification server to deliver that to the actual cell phone. So again, as a reminder, this works with the IDIS mobile application running on your mobile phone. As long as this NVR is registered to the IDIS mobile application on your cell phone, then the rest of the configuration is all done automatically, and you will receive the push notification based on the event type that you configured earlier on. Again, for the NetFS that we talked about earlier, this is where we would set up the FTP server. So if you did have an FTP server, you would set that up here, and what type of file you wanted to upload to the FTP site as such. Okay, so those are really the configurations for notifications. We'll have a look at the display section next. So in the display section, what this means is this is the monitor that's connected to the NVR, the configuration of that monitor. So on that monitor, we saw the live video before. We saw a couple of icons and dates and times and things on the live video. And so this is really the OSD section, is what do you want to display on the main monitor? Do you want the camera number, the title, the date and time, resolution and the codec, etc. displayed? And then all the other functions as well. Do you want these functions to be available on that menu. Do you want to be able to do PTZ and so forth on that? Do you want to have these icons available? And then the main monitor section is for the actual main monitor. What's important here is like the resolution for the monitor is done automatically. If you are putting a different type of monitor, like a 4K monitor or something like that, make sure that you come and configure what the resolution of that monitor is properly, in order not to have some missing display or a non-display at all. So we'll just keep that in the manual section right now. Sequences are what we talked about before. Camera sequence is a full sequence, meaning that the last tile on the camera, on the layout in the live section, will switch from one camera to the next. It'll sequence that'll be a full sequence, and you enable that again on the live screen that we talked about before. On this live section here at the bottom, there's a section called Use BRP mode, or Use Boost Remote Performance mode. The NVR has the capability to show you the live pictures on the main screen, as we saw before. But if you are configuring this NVR and then disconnecting the monitor from it and putting it inside a rack and relying on the IDIS Center software to view the live video, which is in most cases what happens, why expend the resources of the NVR to drive the live video to the monitor? We can use those resources to increase the bitrate to remote viewing on the IDIS Center computers. So if we enable this, you can see here it'll say that remote performance will change to 100 megabits per second, but live monitoring will be off. So if I enable that, and we now go back to the network section that we were in before, let's save what we did. We go back to the network section, you'll see that this bitrate here, which is the network bandwidth limit, has now been raised from 50 megabits per second to 100 megabits per second. So we've in fact doubled our remote performance for this, meaning that the remote clients connecting via IDIS Center software will be able to use the bigger pipeline of 100 megabits per second instead of the 50 megabits per second before. What does this do? If we go back to the main page, we'll see now on the live view, we can't see the live pictures anymore from the cameras, and it instead has a BRP mode on there. So the resources that the processor was using in order to show us the live pictures has now been redirected to give us more bandwidth for the live video on a computer running IDIS Center. So this is quite a good idea. If you finished configuring the NVR completely, and the intention is then to put the NVR into a rack without a permanent monitor connected, that is not going to be used as a monitoring station, that is a good idea to go ahead and enable the BRP mode under main monitor here, and that'll give you some extra power or an extra bitrate in order to serve the computers that are running IDIS Center and remote connecting to this NVR. Right, and then we get to the last section of the NVR, or the last menu of the NVR is called the status menu, and this basically gives us a single screen look on each of the sections of the NVR to identify possible problems that may be happening on the NVR. So on this one, we've got a device here. We see that there's a device, and this is an alarm output. That device output is turned on. You remember we turned on the output for the camera on this one. Under camera we can see different icons, and so what we're looking for here is anything highlighted in yellow. If something's highlighted in yellow, that means that it's receiving an event or receiving a status which may or may not be a problem in the system. So look out for anything in yellow. Of course, yeah, we would see motion detections happening on the cameras. If there was motion on the camera, we would see that in yellow at the top here. And if it was not recording and so forth, we would see that as well. So basically what you're looking for in this page or these pages is anything highlighted in yellow to attract your attention to say that there might be a specific problem on the device. So even under system and storage here, we can see the storage condition here internally, the good temperature, there's no disk problems on there, and the recorded data as well. So all of those pages just basically signifying or doing a health check on the system to make sure that that we don't have any problems. The last item on here, the network item, is very, very interesting and gives us an insight into the back of the device, or the connections to the device, the physical connections plugged into the back of the NVR. So you can see here, this is what the back of this NVR looks like. It has 16 PoE ports. It's also got one additional video in extension port here. As we discussed before, the video in extension port plus the 16 PoE ports all form one network connection, meaning connected to one network interface card. You can see that as a switch, if you like, an internal switch in the device inside the NVR. And we've got 4 cameras connected to that switch into the ports that you see there, 1, 3, 5, and 9. And each camera here, if I click on the camera, I can see some details of that specific camera. I can see the switch port, I can see the live PoE draw of that camera on the NVR, and I can see the camera model, MAC address, and so forth. I can also click on the network client computer here, and I would be able to see the network clients that are connected to my NVR. Right now I don't have any network client connections, and we'll again have a look at this more closely when we look at the IDIS Center software running on the actual PC itself. We'll be able to see those connections being established there. So this is a really good page that will highlight any problems, or that shows you the outline connections or the physical connections to the NVR, what speed they are, where you may have some issues, and you can also see at the top here the PoE consumption of all the cameras on the device right now is 20 watts for these 4 cameras, and the device can handle a maximum of 120 watts, so you can monitor the health of your PoE power here as well. Okay, so that really covers all the setup menu of the NVR itself. We're back on the live page here, and remember, right clicking on this page takes us to the camera registration menu, and the camera registration menu under the scan button and third party scan, which take us to the section where we can get the NIC card settings of the camera side NIC card as opposed to the client side NIC card. So that's the thing that everybody forgets very, very often. All right. One more thing that we'll look at here is back-end camera registration. There are some menus at the top here, and a couple of them can be quite useful. Bitrate is the same tool that we had in the camera section when we were looking at the stream settings of the actual camera itself. So if I click on bitrate, there's the same configuration or bitrate allocation for each channel, where we could borrow from one channel and transfer that bitrate to another channel, and that was the way that we achieved 20 megabits per second on channel 1, because we reduced channel 16 to 0, and we could take that extra bitrate and add that onto channel number 1. So this is the same tool as we had previously, and if I click cancel on that, the last item here is the tool item, which has got some functions to it. And remember that we talked about our direct IP cameras. This is a tool that we can use to change the protocol of the camera, of an IDIS camera connected to the NVR. We have to do this prior to finally registering the camera. So in other words, if I wanted to change the protocol of camera number 1 from direct IP into IDIS mode, I would have to first unregister that camera from the NVR, rediscover it, but not complete the step into registration, and then change the protocol. Once I've changed the protocol of the camera, then I could finalize the connection or the registration of that camera into the NVR. Right, this is not used very much, but in some cases you may want to change the protocol of a camera because you've changed your camera network, and you may need to assign an IP address to it, etc. So if you need to do that, this is where you would find the tools to be able to change the cameras. We also have IDIS Discovery, which is a tool that you can use on a computer to discover IDIS cameras and to also change the modes of those cameras, assign IP addresses and passwords if you need to, or default the cameras as such. Right, that concludes the summary of all the setup functions of the NVR. So the next video is going to introduce IDIS Center and registering an NVR to IDIS Center, and then the functions of the live and recorded video views that you can get on IDIS Center, and how to remotely administer the NVR from the computer. Right, so now we're going to have a look at IDIS Center Remote Administration System. This is our free VMS that's downloadable on our website, and this is used to monitor and to view video from our NVRs, and also to playback video from those NVRs, and can also be used for maintenance and remote setup of our system. So to log in, we'll present you with the username and password. Take note that this is the username and password for starting up the software on a PC. So each instance of IDIS Center is a standalone instance, meaning that it's not a network software or a server-based software. It's a standalone software that you can register multiple NVRs into IDIS Center to view the video. So the username and password that you see here is the username and password to start IDIS Center software. It has nothing to do with the usernames and passwords that we defined on the NVRs. We will see where those usernames and passwords are used in order to register the NVR into IDIS Center software, but the startup username and password here is only to start the software. Right, so when it started, what you'll see here on the left hand side is what we call a site tree. Here you have various menu items that we'll go through. You also have an event pane on the bottom left hand side. Then we have tabs on the top here with all the different functions of the IDIS Center software, and some menu items at the top. In the center here, where we have the camera panes, we call them panes, or if you want to call them camera windows. And if we look at a live tab on the top, this is what a live tab will look like. In this case, we have 4 by 4 camera panes, and these layouts can be changed, for example 2 by 2 or 3 by 3, 4 by 4, 5 by 5, etc., as well as some custom type layouts. Here's one with 2 big panes at the top and 8 smaller ones at the bottom. So you can define the layout as you like in IDIS Center, either in the live tab or the play tab. So what is a live tab? A live tab is to view live video from an NVR. So the pictures we would see in here would be live, meaning they're happening right now. The play tab is to play recorded video. So we have space at the bottom for some timelines, and then we have some menu items here that will have functionality in the recorded video. And the live video also has icons and controls pertinent to viewing live video. So let's have a look how this operates. If we look under all devices, these are all the NVRs that we have connected to the system. And so if we click on the little arrow next to the NVR, we'll be able to see the cameras that are connected to that specific NVR. And if we take a camera and drag it into a window and drop it into that window, we'll see the actual camera image in there. If we double click on the image, we can see a larger version of the image. And of course now we can also do, this is a fisheye camera, and so we can do fisheye dewarping into this camera and control it with the mouse, which is immediate. In the Play tab, if we do the same thing in the Play tab, when we take the camera and drop it into a window and do it full screen, the difference there is obviously this is a recorded image that you're looking at right now. At the bottom you'll see the timeline going back in history. We can click anywhere on the timeline to go back in the recorded history. We can press Control while having our mouse in the function here, press Control and use the mouse wheel in order to expand the timeline, and then we can also drag the timeline from left to right, right to left, etc. In the timeline at this time you'll see a light blue color, and then you'll also see some darker purple marks. So the purple marks are identifying where motion occurred in the timeline of the camera. So if we press play here, we're able to play the video, also scrub through it faster in a forward motion or in a reverse motion as well. We can also go frame by frame. So in the play controls here at the bottom, we can go forward frame by frame or in reverse frame by frame as well. Right, so those are the live and the play screens. We've also got a health indication, yes, so there's a health tab that'll tell us basically a health condition for all the NVRs connected to the system. This is basically just a single page glance so that we can pick out where we may have problems in the system. We can also generate instant reports of the system or of particular NVRs. Again, here at the top we've got a drop down that'll say it's a user log or a health log or an event log. So for example, if we choose an event log and we take an NVR and drop it into the screen, it'll generate a report from that NVR, in this case telling us where motion detections have happened or any other events in the system have happened on this particular NVR. There's also a status page where we can get an instant visual of a particular device where there may be or may not be any problems on a device. This will give you kind of a one-page glance as to all the items on an NVR, meaning events, whether the cameras are recording or not, the alarm out functions, and system check functions as well. There's also a self-diagnosis tab where we can drag and drop the NVR into the self-diagnosis tab to generate a specific report from the NVR and test a lot of functionality on the NVR itself. We can test camera connections to the NVR, we can test the hard drive, we can test the recording quality, and also see a lot of details of the specific NVR. Alright, so here we see a typical report from the NVR. We've got the model at the top with the camera count and also the current firmware that's loaded. We can see cameras in green at the top where they are connected. We can also see, in this case, we've got a VA box that's not connected on some channels, and also we can see the recording status. So in this case we can see the internal hard drives plus external hard drive connected to eSATA boxes. We can see the status of those, all good. We can scroll down and see the cameras, and as you can see with the cameras, we have we have the camera model, we have the IP address, which again in this case is just going to be the link local address that we talked about before. We've got the camera hardware or software version here, and also a connection and network status test that was performed at the time of dragging this into the self-diagnosis window. We can also then see the PoE draw of the cameras at the time of dragging it into the window. Scroll down, we can see all the cameras. We can also see any events that are turned on for that specific camera in the configuration. So all of these cameras have got motion detection turned on. And then of course we can see the network connections also for this particular NVR. We can see the IP address information. We can see the remote connections to the device as well. Then we can also see the video in network information. This is the camera network that we talked about with its IP address information. The remote connections that are connected to the NVR is remote clients that are connected to the NVR, and you can see the type of sessions that have opened up here as well. The remote watch is a session opened by an IDIS Center computer to view the video. The remote search is a session open to view recorded video, and the remote admin is an admin session open to configure NVRs. So these are the types of sessions that are opened by remote clients or network clients into the NVR itself, and there we can see the IP addresses from those clients. So this is a very useful report that should be probably your first line if you're having trouble with an NVR, is to do this report, the self-diagnosis report. Download that and have a look at it, see if that'll give you any pointers to the problem. Also on the right hand side here, there is a troubleshooting report, and this is something that you can generate by clicking on the plus sign here, and this will generate a report that you see here. And if you want to then download that report after it's generated, you can highlight the report, click on the little down arrow here, which will actually download that into your computer. This is something that we'll request from you if you contact us for technical support, and you can send us this report, and that'll provide us with some log files on the particular NVR as well. Right, so how do we actually get the NVR onto the IDIS Center software? That's by a process called registration. Just as we registered cameras onto the NVR itself, in IDIS Center we're going to register NVRs onto the IDIS Center system. So this is done in the IDIS Center setup. There's various ways to get to the IDIS Center setup. Either we can go to System and IDIS Center Setup, and any of these will open up the same window. So if I click on Device, it'll open up this configuration window and park the menu on the device menu. Any one of these would have opened it into the same menu. There's another way of opening up the IDIS Center setup, and that's just to double click this blue dot in the top left hand side, and that will open up IDIS Center setup as well. Right, in the setup window here we have menus on the left hand side. Just like we did in the NVR, we have menu sections in the top left, and then on the right hand side that's followed by either submenus or a secondary data field on the right hand side. So to register an NVR into the IDIS Center software, I need to be on Device, All Devices. In the third section here I'm going to click on the plus sign, which will provide me with a window in order to register the NVR onto my IDIS Center software. So there are various methods for registering the NVR or for discovering the NVR on the network or over the internet. It all depends on how you're connected to that NVR from your IDIS Center software. If you're on the same local network, then of course your scan mode can just be auto scan the LAN. If I auto scan the LAN, I should be able to find a particular NVR, and what I find immediately is the Leon-test NVR that we were looking at earlier on and that we configured earlier on. Remember that we configured it with a FEN name, but in this case I'm just finding the NVR with a local IP address, in this case 192.168.0.214, and I found the actual IP address. So I can stop the scan here. I'm going to close this up real quick. I'm not going to go through with the registration. Let's look at another way that we can discover the same NVR. Let's look at another way that we can discover the NVR. And in this case, I'm going to go to IP address. So in this case, I know that my IP address is 192.168.0.214. and the port number I'm going to leave at 8016. Start the scan, and there we find the same NVR, but this time we found it using the actual IP address instead of just auto scanning the LAN. So I'm going to not register it. We're going to look at a third way of discovering the NVR, and you remember that we defined a FEN name for the device. So using the FEN option, we can go and enter the FEN name that we used, which was test-ls. Start the scan, and then that finds the device again via the actual FEN name this time. So if your computer is on the same network as the NVR and it's a desktop computer, then by all means use the AutoScan LAN option to register the NVR or to discover the NVR and register it to the IDIS Center software. However, if it's a laptop type computer and you may be using IDIS Center on that laptop in order to connect to the cameras when you're not on the local network and trying to connect remotely, then registering the camera via the AutoScan LAN option, which is using the local IP address, is not going to work when you're trying to connect remotely. In that case, the best option is to use the FEN option, or alternatively to use the public IP and port number in order to register the NVR. So in this case, we're going to use the FEN connection in order to discover the NVR, and we're going to register it using that option as well. So in this case, I'm going to add the device. Now we see that it asks us for a username and password. So this is again really important to understand. The username and password here is how you want to register the NVR and what credentials you want to use to register the NVR to the IDIS Center software. Remember that in the NVR we could create multiple groups of users with different permissions. So the credentials that you use to register the NVR into IDIS Center will also determine what permissions this particular user has for remote configuration of that NVR. So if your intention is to limit the configuration options for this particular user, then you wouldn't want to register the NVR to his IDIS Center with the admin credentials of the NVR. That wouldn't make any sense, because he could then connect to that NVR with the admin credentials and configure the NVR. If this is a guard type user or somebody that doesn't have the permissions to alter the content of the NVR, then make sure that when you register the NVR to his IDIS Center software, that you use a lower level credential that doesn't allow him access to configure the NVR. You can also control user permissions within IDIS Center if you're going to be an administrator installing the software for another user. And we'll have a look at that in a little while. So the credentials I'm going to use here are going to be the administrator credentials that I entered when we did the setup. And you can see now that I've entered the credentials, the NVR is in a status called registered. And so it's now registered to my device via the FEN name. Right, you see I've got a lot of NVRs on my particular IDIS Center. What is the capability of IDIS Center? Well, most people think that when you have a free software, it's got to have limited capability. IDIS Center can actually register 1,024 devices to IDIS Center. So in this case, we're not talking about cameras, we're talking about devices. In IDIS, we talk about devices rather than cameras. So you could connect 1,024 NVRs to IDIS Center, and if each of those NVRs are a 64-channel NVR, then that gives you more than 64,000 cameras that you could actually potentially monitor with the IDIS Center software. So it's really not a light version at all. It has quite a lot of capability. And we go to a live page, for example. Make this into 2 by 2. Scroll down on your device tree in the left hand side, and we should find the NVR there, Leon Test. Drag that into the window here, and there we see the cameras that we connected to the actual NVR. Again, if we double click on any page or on any particular camera, we can then full screen that camera, or double click again and go back to a 2 by 2 layout in this case. Right, so that's how easy it was to actually register the NVR into IDIS Center. If we wanted to remove the NVR, again, go back to System, IDIS Center Setup, Device, and then find the actual NVR. Highlight it and click on the minus sign to delete the device. We can also edit the device. By editing the device, we get 3 tabs: an information tab, a network tab, and a direct NDC tab. The information tab basically gives us some options here, tells us a little bit about the device, if it's in a group or not. In this case, we just know it's a 16-channel NVR, and we are syncing the device name, which means that if the device name should change, we'll update the device name on the left-hand side here as well. Device real-time monitoring is an option that we need to talk about. Device real-time monitoring for most users should be turned off. What does that mean? Well, when we look at the camera pictures here on the left-hand side, we also see that we've got an event pane on the left-hand side here. So when the NVR is working, it's sending video to anybody that requests the video. So for example, my IDIS Center has requested the video here, and we're sending the video to IDIS Center. Alongside that, we're also sending event status to the IDIS Center software as well. So where we have motion detections or any other type of events from a device, that's being sent to IDIS Center as well. So even if you're not watching the actual cameras, even if you're not displaying the cameras, there is still a connection between the NVR and IDIS Center in order to send these events into IDIS Center software. So care should be taken that these events are taking up what we call a watch session from the IDIS Center to the NVR. And the NVR has some limited capabilities and can only support 10 watch sessions at the same time, which means that if you're taking up watch sessions out of the NVR, there's a possibility that somebody else may not be able to connect to the NVR to view video. Even though nobody else is watching any video, they're still taking up watch sessions because of this function. So only really a guard needs to see these events on the left-hand side, even if he's not watching the camera. So for most other users, it's a very, very good idea to stop these events from displaying if we're not actively watching the cameras. So when you install IDIS Center software for a particular user, it's a good idea to come in here and to turn off device real-time monitoring for that particular NVR. If I do that, then the events from that NVR will not be displayed on the left-hand side here unless I'm actively viewing the cameras from that particular NVR at the same time. This can also be automated in another menu item. In the system menu here, you will see that there's a device real-time monitoring option here, and we can ask for device-specific setup, which is my configuration right now, which means I have to decide for each device whether I want to have the real-time monitoring turned on or off. It's a good idea for most users just to say all devices deactivated. And if I select that option, this will be deactivated for all devices connected to my IDIS Center software. So now if we go back to the device menu and we look at any NVR, edit the device, we'll see that the device real-time monitoring has been turned off, and you can also see the events have stopped populating here on the left-hand side unless we're actively watching the camera. In the live view pane here, each camera has a sub-menu. If I move the mouse to the bottom of the picture, then a icon menu is displayed. Also, if we right click on the actual camera picture, then there are some text items which coincide with the icons that we saw before. So there are two ways of activating the camera options, either via these texts or via the icons on the bottom of the camera picture. This icon here is fisheye warping. If I click on fisheye warping, there's a few things that I can do with it. First of all, I can use my right mouse button and move my mouse, and that'll de-warp the camera picture and be able to turn that picture just like a PTZ camera, like we saw before with a fisheye camera. And of course I can zoom out of that picture as well. If I right click, I also have the fisheye de-warping option. In this case we're just seeing the main view. We can change that into main +5 panes, for example. This will display the main picture plus 5 smaller pictures, and each one of these pictures are individually controllable with the mouse, and each one is still the full 360-degree picture. I can do right click on this and go fisheye de-warping and go to auto pan, for example, choose a direction and a speed, and then this picture will pan around in a certain direction. I'll go to the picture above that, choose the same thing, fisheye de-warping, auto pan, and go the opposite direction at a different speed. So these are various things that you can do depending on the type of camera you're connected to and what menu item you choose from here. We can also do audio controls. The listen option will play audio from the camera if the camera has a built-in microphone or an external microphone connected to it. And so the other camera options that are available on the menu is an instant playback. In the live screen, we can play back recorded video up to 3 minutes without needing to go into the play tab and dragging that camera into the play tab and then finding in the timeline the part of the video that we want to play. If we just right click and go to instant playback here, we can play back the last 20 seconds, for example, of video in this particular camera, and you'll see at the top here there's the timeline. We can also drag that timeline back and forth, and this is anywhere within that 20 seconds worth of playback that we're doing. We can obviously exit out of this playback as well. Right, we can also do color control of the camera, so we can change the color settings of the camera. If I click on there, we'll see that the menu in the bottom right hand side of the camera is opened up, and I can set the brightness of the camera, the contrast, also the color depth of the camera right here. Click on the X sign to exit out of there. I'm also able to control the alarm output here. In this case I can control the alarm output of the actual NVR, turn it on or off. That could open a door or turn on a siren or something controlled by the actual relay contact on the NVR itself. I can also look at the multiple streams of the cameras. So an explanation to that is, if I right click on this camera and choose stream information, we can see the stream information on the right hand side here. Right now the resolution of this particular stream is 5 megapixel, as you can see, with a frame rate of 30 frames a second, and this is stream number 1 with an H.264 codec, and at the top you can see that this is a live session information coming from the actual NVR itself. Now if we do the same thing but we view the camera in a smaller format, meaning in a 2x2 format, you can see now that the resolution of the camera has reduced, and we're now streaming stream number 2. So the resolution is now dropped to 640 by 512, still with a frame rate of 30 frames a second, but you can see that the bit rate is now a lot lower at 514 kilobits per second. Prior to that, the bit rate was 16 1000 kilobits per second or 16 megabits per second for a larger picture. So this is what we call dynamic multi-stream control. Depending on how you're viewing the camera will send a different stream, because when we view the camera in a smaller format like this, to stream 5 megapixels into a smaller format would not give us any more clarity or a clearer picture. It's only when we view the camera in a larger format that we can make use of the higher resolution and sometimes higher frame rate as well, depending on how we configured the camera streams. Remember when we were doing the configuration of the camera stream within the NVR, we had stream number 1, stream number 2, and stream number 3. So that is what this live stream 1 or live stream 2 is referring to. It's the streams that we configured so that we don't waste bitrate or bandwidth when we're viewing high resolution cameras in a very small format. And again, when we're viewing this on a cellular phone or on a tablet, then we most times stream number 3, which may even be a lower resolution than the stream number 2. So instead of having that controlled manually, when we right click on the camera and choose multi-stream, we can also switch streams manually here. So I could switch this to a stream number 2. You can see that the picture went a little bit more fuzzy and that the resolution has now gone to 640 by 512. Even though we're viewing the camera in a larger format, the resolution is much lower because I've manually switched the stream to stream number 2 or even stream number 3. So in this case I want to go back in multi-stream. We want to go back to dynamic control so that the camera will control what stream is being sent based on the actual viewer of the video. We can also take a still image of the actual camera picture. So if I go to still image and go to quick save, we're able to save a image on this window. You can see that the heat map demo image has been saved, and it gives us some date and time details on that as well. Alright, and to remove the camera, we can click on remove camera or remove all cameras. Right, let's go up to IDIS Center Setup once more and go through the menu items available on the configuration screen. In the device menu, this is where we added new device to the system, and a device being the NVR. So we added a lot of NVRs to our system. We can also group these NVRs together. So we can, in the device group here, we can add another device group, and let's call this the training group. And here you can see that we can select different NVRs to add to that particular group. So I can choose this particular NVR, or we can even select particular cameras to add to that group. So you don't have to select the whole NVR, meaning that you can select, let's say, 3 cameras from this particular NVR here for that particular group. So I've chosen one full NVR. If we look at that, we've got one full NVR here, and for the other NVR we've got just 3 cameras from that particular NVR added. Groups are very useful for grouping cameras together, especially for live monitoring. So instead of trying to remember which cameras are on the western side of a building, which cameras are on the eastern side of a building, etc., you can create groups called East and West and pre-configure them, pre-fill those groups with the cameras from the west wing or from the east wing, etc. And then these groups are easy to use when we actually do live monitoring. Let's have a look at that. If we go here and close off the all devices section, we can see the group section here, and we can see the training section and we could just take all the training cameras and drag them in, and we will see the cameras associated with the actual training group as such. And then of course we could also see the individual cameras attached to that training group as well. Right, so the next section down in the setup is called layouts, and here we can create different layouts. So if I take a layout and click on the plus button here, we can then decide what layout we want to create. In this case I'm going to try and create a layout of 1:7, which will give me one large picture and 7 smaller pictures. I can then go to my groups or go to all devices, either way, and select my NVR once more, and then select which cameras I want to put within that put that camera in the larger view, and then put some other cameras into the smaller view. As you can see, we need to enter a name for the layout and a description if you have one. Also how you want to share the layout, whether it's going to be public. This is only really relevant if you have multiple users on the same computer running IDIS Center. If it's then you will share it with the other users, or you can keep the layout private as well. So when I click OK on that, that's created my training layout. And if we go to the training layout on the main page, can drop that into the system here, and you can see that's what we created right now. One large camera and then the 7 smaller camera tabs. In my layout I can also edit the layout, and instead of having a camera picture in the large one here, I could set a hotspot and an event spot in the other windows. So what is a hotspot and event spot? Let's go and look at how this layout has changed. Take that layout and drag it back into the window. What you'll see now is that we've got a red square where the larger window was, and we've got some blue squares on the right hand side. These are designated as event spots. The larger one is designated as a hotspot. So what is a hotspot? This red area here. Any smaller camera that I click on will automatically go into the larger area. So if I click on the small camera at the bottom, we'll see the larger version of that camera at the top. That's what's called a hotspot. This is a good way for a guard to view many small cameras, and if he sees something of interest on a particular camera picture, he can then increase the size of that camera and view it in a larger format as clicking around. On the right hand side I've got event spots. These 3 cameras on the right hand side were designated as event spot, and any camera on the system that detects an event, in most cases it's going to be a motion event, will be automatically populated into that window, and they'll sequence through those 3 windows that are designated as event spots. Right, let's go back to the setup once more. We can also sequence layouts, so we can build layout sequences, for example. We can build a sequence like this, call this a training sequence, and now I can take different layouts. For example, the layout that we just created. I'm not quite sure of if these other layouts work, but let's try them. So each layout will be individually displayed for a number of seconds. In this case 120. I'm going to reduce that to 10 seconds and apply that to all, so that each layout will be played for 10 seconds. Let's say OK and OK on that one. Now if we go down to layout sequence on the left hand side and we drop in the training layout, we should then get the two layouts displayed. So this is my first layout that we created, and this should play for 10 seconds, and then that should switch over to a secondary layout that you can see here right now, which is playing now, and then 10 seconds later we should have a third layout displayed. There's the third layout. Okay. And we can do the same thing with camera sequences as well. If we add a camera sequence, call it training once more, we can then sequence through specific cameras in a window. So if we go back to our NVR, for example, and drop in some cameras, and again play each one for 10 seconds, apply that to all, we should then be able to take the training sequence and drop that in and display each camera for 10 seconds. Now you could have multiple camera sequences on your monitoring window. So for example, if I was a guard monitoring and I chose to have a layout like this, for example, I could have this training sequence in a small window where I can see different cameras. So instead of just displaying one camera, I can now display a sequence of cameras in all the small layouts here, and then still do let's say a hotspot on top here, so that if I see something I can click on that and then that will be displayed in a larger format. Right, so back to the IDIS Center setup. The next thing that we can do is a map. So maps are very, very useful for live monitoring and to give a situational awareness of where the cameras are located or what purpose the cameras are for. So we can create a new map, call it, give it a name, and then we need to load a background image. So we can go to this icon here to load a background image. We can use any JPEG, GIF or PNG type image. In this case we're just going to use one of the built-in images. So this could be a Google map, it could be a plan of a floor layout of an office building, etc. In this case we're just going to use this map, and so once you've loaded the background image you can then go and find cameras to overlay on top of this image. So in this case here I'm going to take a camera here, drag it into the system. You can see the icon displayed right now is a dome camera. If I don't want the dome camera, I can go to the top right hand side here where it says icon, click on that, change the icon, and we could make this into a bullet style camera, for example, and place that camera there. We can also increase the size of this camera by holding the corners, adjusting the size of the camera, and then of course we can also rotate the camera if we need to. On the top here we could create a halo effect for the camera, so if we turn that on we can now put that white circle around the camera, or we can change the color of that white circle, for example, into a red circle. So now we've got a red background for the camera, makes it a little bit easier to see. We can also turn on the camera view. You see the purple here of representing what the actual camera is viewing, and we can increase the size of that camera view as well. So we can increase the size of that or the angle of that camera. Let me change the size to 5, for example, and we'll now see that the size of the actual view has changed. So all those can be added to the actual camera itself. Let's drop a few more cameras onto the map here and click on OK. So that was very easy to create a map. Let's go and test the map. We go back down to the map section here, look at our training map, drag that into the larger window here, and there is the map that we created earlier on. If I click on the actual camera icon, we can bring up the actual image of the camera here, which will stay here for about 10 seconds, and I can see all of my camera views if I need to click them. So for situational awareness, this is a lot easier to view the cameras in this format. You'll also see that in this case we picked up a motion event on the camera, and the image zoomed into that particular camera to assist the guard into locating where the actual camera is located. Right click, we can turn the auto focusing on, which will keep the map zoomed out into this area right here. If I look at a mini camera image on the map like that, I can also click on my control button, hold control, take the image and drag that into an available camera tile, drop it into that tile, and then that camera will permanently be displayed in that particular camera tile. Right, the last function here is a browser. We can also display a browser window inside any camera tile. So let's add a browser window. We'll call it the weather, and just use a weather.com URL. Say OK, and now on the bottom here we can go to the browser and drop in the weather URL there. As you can see, this is going to display the weather map. So this is particularly useful if we have maybe an access control system that has a web interface, or even something like email for the guard, where he doesn't have to actually close this application in order to go and read email. So now we've had a look at the device menu inside IDIS Center Setup. We've also got a user menu. So this is very, very similar to the user setup that we did inside the NVR, except this is for users of this particular IDIS Center software on this particular computer only. So again, if this is a personal computer that's only used by one person, there's no need to set up any users or special logins or anything like that. We can just use the standard admin login for this particular user. However, if this computer is being used by multiple users, then it's good to set a username and password for each user of the software, where they can then define their own maps and their own layouts and things that we saw earlier on. You can also then limit permissions for those users on things that they can do. So if you want to limit the cameras that a particular user can see, then you would do it on this section, making sure that you are the administrator that will configure IDIS Center on their computer and log out, so that when they log in with their credentials, that the limitations that you've set will take effect on this computer. So again, we can look at the groups on the left hand side here. Currently we've got administrator group and an operator group. Let's create a third group that's called guards, for example. And we can fill in a description. We can now go to the device access authority, which will select which devices this particular user can access or not. These should be predefined in the groups. So I can select which group I want this particular user to, which cameras of the particular group that he can view. So in this case, I'm going to give him access to the training groups that I created, and one of these groups above, and click on OK. Right, now I can click on the Authority tab, and in Authority, this is where we can enable or disable particular functions that this particular user can perform on the IDIS Center setup. So, for example, on the groups of NVRs that we've allocated, would you allow the user to do device setup? No, so we're going to deny any type of device setup. Live watch, yes. PTZ control, yes. PTZ setup, possibly not. Iris control, yes. Audio controls, yes. Export image, play controls, we can do all those. Health monitoring, log search, and so forth. So everything else we'll allow the user to do, but just no setup functionality as such. Now that we've created the test user, which is a user under the guards group, we can log out of IDIS Center, and that person can log in, and he will be able to see the cameras that we defined and have the permissions that we defined for that particular user. Right, the next one we're going to look at is the system menu. We've looked at one item in system menu before. That was the device real-time monitoring. I would advise that anytime that you install IDIS Center, that you have device real-time monitoring set to all devices deactivated. Only really for guards that you want to have those real-time monitoring messages, which again are these messages in the bottom left-hand side here that are taking up a watch session for each of the NVRs that they're connected to. So please configure this with all devices deactivated. We're not going to go through each particular item here. At the bottom is your date and time formats, the way that you want them to display. On the screen format, you can decide whether you want to place your site tree on the left side or the right side to have your event pane visible or not visible. You can also decide on a specific default layout that you want to load when you load a live or a playback or a map screen. On the screen display, you can decide whether you want the date and the time or any of the other items on the live screen or playback screen visible. And on the screen menu, you can decide when you right click on a camera which of these screen menus you would like to have visible and configurable. On video enhancement, and since most of these are kind of advanced settings, shouldn't really be adjusted, they'll be automatically set for you. One thing to note is the drawing mode. If you're having any trouble with fisheye cameras, dewarping them and the control doesn't seem to work properly, change the drawing mode and see if that solves the problem. If not, contact IDIS technical support and we'll try and help you out with the settings on there. In the center here, you will see dynamic multi-stream control. We talked about that. This was the way that the camera either sends its stream number 1 or stream number 2 to the live screen, depending on how we're viewing the video, whether we're viewing it in a large format or a smaller format, and that gets controlled by these. Normally they set to auto. You'll remember when we changed to a 2x2 layout that we started using stream number 2. If you want to force it so that that still uses stream number 1, then we can go here and change this to very high option here, which will force your stream number 1. This is basically stream number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is the way that you can force those streams, but in most cases you just want to leave these as auto, and the system will configure the streams as required. In the report section here, you can define how many log entries should be in the log list. At the moment is 100, and this can be set up to 10,000 items in the log list. Alright, on the health tab, remember that the health tab was kind of a single glance of all the items connected to your IDIS Center, all the devices. How often does that update? That you can configure here is currently using a 1 hour update, and that can be changed to minutes or into several hours as well. There's really no need to go any shorter than 1 hour, but if you have a particular need for particular updates, you can set that time to be shorter. On the instant event tab here, we can control the event panel, which is again this panel in the bottom left hand side. We can turn it on or off. or see what type of time range we want to keep these events on screen for. There are some callback port configurations here. Remember, the callbacks from the NVR were for sending specific events from the NVR to either the maintenance computer or the security computer, and that used the port number. This is the corresponding port number in the computer here, so if you're going to change it on one side, make sure that you change the port number on both sides. Again, no particular reason for you to change the ports. Event sounds. If you want event sounds to play on your computer when these particular events are triggered, you can enable and then play the actual event sound. Be careful with these sounds, and you can also load your own WAV files to have custom sounds. The action section of the setup menu allows us to add some customizations. For example, if we enable PTZ automatically or use ePTZ at the bottom of the page, what that means is that as soon as we drop a PTZ or a fisheye camera into a camera pane, we can immediately drag the camera to pan the camera or zoom into the camera. We don't have to first turn on the PTZ controls in order to do that. So those are quite useful to enable automatically. We can also define on a live pop-up what happens with the mouse button. You can customize some controls of the mouse button functionality. And then the last section in the setup is when we save a still image, what is the file name format, and also where is the folder where those images are saved into. Right, so that was kind of an overview of the menu systems available on IDIS Center, mainly for the setup configuration. Let's have a look at the controls below the camera panes. So first of all, we have device layouts where we can change the layout of the screen, and we can also save that particular layout, for example, by clicking this button on the bottom left hand side. So if we want to create a new layout without using the IDIS Center setup function, we can create a layout on the fly. So let's add some cameras to this particular layout. So if this was a layout that I wanted to save, I could click this button here and save this as a test training layout, for example. And once I've done that, if I go to my layouts on the left hand side, I should see a test training layout there, which if I drop that in will display these cameras, and in this case a web page at the same time. Also on the bottom here I have some icons for the hotspot that we saw before and the event spot that we saw as well, so you could turn on the event spot just from the icons at the bottom of the page. Saving an image or exporting an image from the live screen. If I click on that, I can export an image file, which will just export the currently selected camera, or export a panorama screen, which will export all the camera pictures that you see on the screen right now. Right, on a play screen, we can take the camera, drag it into the window, and then see the timeline at the bottom, and use our control mouse wheel to zoom into the timeline. We can then see motion events on the actual camera itself. Play those, scrub forward, backwards, as we talked about earlier on. We can also save images from here. We can export a still image of that camera picture, or we can also export a video file. So exporting a video file, we can click on that. That'll open up this window, and it'll ask us for the date and time that we want to export, in this case from and to. Okay. So we can choose our date and time here, so we can reduce the time on this one to 56. So we'll export 1 minute's worth of video here. In this case it's just one camera. If we had multiple cameras on the screen, we could export multiple cameras. Choose a start, choose a location for that, say save, and it'll tell us that this is going to be a 16 megabyte file with that date and time, and we can go ahead and export the video clip from there. Okay, the other icons on the bottom of the page here, we can go to a specific date and time. First of all, we can click on the timeline and drag the timeline into previous history, and click anywhere on the timeline to go to that previous history. Or we can go to a specific date and time by using the go to option, so we can select the date and the time that we want to go to in the recorded video. We can also select from a calendar, go to a specific date. Let's go to Friday the 1st, for example, and that'll go to midnight of that particular date. So then we can drag through and go to the particular time that we're actually looking for in the recorded video. The other option that we can do is to search for specific types of events, video with specific types of events and selected cameras as well. So we can search for all events, or we can search for particular types of events only. Let's say motion type events or recording failure type events, etc. That's kind of a summary of all the functionality as it pertains to a viewer viewing live video or recorded video on the actual IDIS Center software. Let's have a look at some of the remote setup functionality that IDIS Center provides to the NVR. So if we go back to IDIS Center setup and we find the NVR that we loaded earlier to the system, Leon Test, if I right click on that and choose remote setup device, this will open up a remote setup window from IDIS Center into the actual NVR itself. And as you can see, the menu system looks very, very similar in this remote setup window to the actual menu inside the NVR. There's a couple of items that are not available via remote setup, but for the most part we can see all the setup of the actual NVR. So if we go to camera, for example, stream number 1, for camera number 1 we can see the setup that we created yesterday for the streaming and so forth. And so we can then set up all the events and motion events and other configuration items that we need to set remotely. So in this case we're opening up a remote setup window into the NVR, obtaining information of the current settings, and we're able to change settings here. For example, I can change the area of detection here and delete maybe some of these blocks in the motion detection area, say OK, and this, when I hit apply, this is going to then send the information back to the NVR and update the NVR configuration, in this case for the cameras. Also very useful and quite unique to IDIS is if we go into the camera menu and go to advanced setup, I can actually then bring up the actual camera settings or the camera configuration instead of having to be on top of a ladder or have a laptop plugged into the network with the browser to try and set camera settings. You can see here we can go to day-night settings and adjust the daytime, nighttime, or the IR mode of the camera directly from here. So this is tunneling from IDIS Center into the NVR and from the NVR into the camera in order to be able to adjust all these settings. So you can kind of see the usefulness of these remote setup settings for the NVR. One more thing that we can do with the NVR in order to have a full remote desktop is we can go into the network settings here, and in the direct NDC option we can enable direct NDC and define a password for that. Remember that this is opening up another port in your NVR, so you probably don't want to leave this open, but for the time that you're configuring the NVR, it is sometimes useful to have a full remote desktop connection in there. So I'm going to enable that with a password, click OK and apply that, and now once it's applied I can go back into the IDIS Center setup, and instead of using the remote setup device I'm going to choose direct NDC. When I select that, it's now going to ask me for the username and password, or it's now going to ask me for the password that we just created. I enter the password and that opens up another window. So this window is a representation of the actual NVR, and in fact this is a remote desktop. As I'm moving the mouse here, it's moving the mouse on the actual NVR. I will not see the actual live video on this page because it is a VNC connection, so bandwidth is a little bit low, so no video is included. However, if I right click on this page, for example, I can go to the camera registration option, see where we registered the cameras. I can get into the scan menu and third party scan, get into advanced setup, and even see the NIC card settings for my camera side network. Go out of this menu and see the setup menu of the NVR and see all the options that we saw when we were actually in the NVR itself. So this is a full remote desktop connection to the actual NVR itself. As I said, this is called direct NDC, which is actually a VNC type connection from your PC to the actual NVR. So two ways of remote setup into the NVR for maintenance purposes or for configuration purposes. So very, very useful as well. Right, so that concludes the introduction to IDIS Center and also the configuration of the actual NVR. Hopefully this has been useful for you. Remember that you can contact IDIS technical support at techsupportus@idisglobal.com. Look forward to talking to you.